Find a comfortable place to settle in, perhaps under a warm blanket or by a window where the light is dim. The world outside can be loud, but here, we let the shadows tell their stories at a slower pace. Whether you are closing your eyes for the night, focusing on your work, or simply passing the time, you are in good company. We will wander through the strange, the unexplained, and the quiet corners of the unknown together. You are listening to Ambient Whispers. If these stories brought you comfort, please leave a like. We invite you to comment and tell us where this whisper was heard tonight. Please subscribe and let these stories be the embers that light your soul. Chapter 1. The Silver Hour on Highway 5. The air in western Washington during the late autumn of 1997 carried a specific kind of weight. It was a damp, heavy cold that didn't just sit on your skin, it seemed to settle into your very bones. On this particular evening, the sky was the color of a bruised plum, shifting from a deep, saturated purple to a slate gray as the sun dipped behind the jagged silhouette of the Olympic Mountains. The man behind the wheel of the old, tan sedan was named Elias Thorne. Elias was a man of quiet habits. He worked as a freelance technical illustrator, a job that required a steady hand and an eye for the smallest, most infinitesimal details. He liked things that made sense. He liked the way a drafting pen felt in his hand, and he liked the predictable rhythm of the windshield wipers as they cleared a light, misty drizzle from the glass. He was driving south on Interstate 5, heading back toward his small cottage on the outskirts of Olympia. The heater in his car was humming a low, rattling tune, struggling to keep the cabin warm against the encroaching evening chill. On the passenger seat sat his Nikon camera, tucked safely inside its padded leather bag. Elias took that camera everywhere. He wasn't a professional photographer, but he found a strange sort of peace in capturing the way the light hit the Douglas firs, or the way the fog pooled in the valleys like spilled milk. The traffic was unusually light for a Friday evening. The road stretched out before him, a black ribbon of wet asphalt reflecting the amber glow of the occasional street lamp. He found himself sinking into that meditative state that only comes from a long solo drive. The world outside the windows was a blur of dark green and gray, a tunnel of trees that felt both protective and a little bit isolating. It was exactly 5:45 in the evening when the atmosphere inside the car began to change. It started with the radio. Elias had been listening to a soft jazz station, the kind of music that feels like velvet. Suddenly, the smooth saxophone notes began to warp. They stretched and thinned, replaced by a low, rhythmic pulsing sound. It wasn't static. Static is sharp and chaotic. This was a deep, melodic thrum, like the sound of a distant heart beating through a thick wall. Elias reached out a hand to adjust the dial, but as his fingers brushed the plastic knob, he felt a tingle of static electricity leap from the dashboard to his skin. It wasn't painful, but it was startling, a tiny spark of blue light in the dim cabin. He pulled his hand back, his brow furrowing in confusion. Then the lights on his dashboard began to flicker. The gentle green glow of the speedometer dimmed, brightened, and then dimmed again as if the car itself were struggling to breathe. He slowed the sedan, his instinct telling him to pull over to the shoulder. He thought perhaps his alternator was failing or a wire had come loose in the damp air. As he eased the car toward the white line, he glanced up through the windshield. At first he thought it was a low-hanging cloud, perhaps a pocket of fog caught in the headlights of a truck he couldn't see. But as his eyes adjusted, he realized the shape was far too defined. Hovering perhaps 50 feet above the stand of old-growth timber to his right was an object that defied every law of physics Elias understood. It was a dull, brushed silver, shaped like a flattened teardrop or a polished river stone. It didn't have wings. It didn't have propellers. It didn't make a sound. It simply hung there, suspended in the heavy, purple air as if it were pinned to the sky. Elias forgot about his flickering dashboard. He forgot about the cold seeping through the door seals. His hands moved with a practiced, mechanical grace, reaching for the camera bag on the passenger seat. He didn't feel fear yet. He felt a profound, overwhelming sense of curiosity. It was the illustrator in him, the man who needed to see the edges of things, who needed to understand how a form occupied space. He stepped out of the car, the cool mist hitting his face. The silence on the highway was now absolute. Even the sound of his own breathing felt muffled, as if he were standing inside a room lined with heavy blankets. He raised the Nikon to his eye. Through the viewfinder, the object looked even more impossible. There were no rivets, no seams. It looked like a single, continuous piece of worked metal, glowing with a soft, internal luminescence that seemed to push back against the gathering dark. He clicked the shutter. Once. Twice. The sound of the mirror flipping up and down was the only noise in the world. He adjusted the focus, his fingers trembling slightly now. He took another shot, capturing the way the pine needles below the craft seemed to be vibrating, though there was no wind. He could see a faint, shimmering distortion in the air beneath the object, like heat rising from a summer road. He moved to the front of his car, leaning against the hood to steady his shot. He went through an entire roll of film, his mind racing to catalog what he was seeing. The craft began to move then, not with a sudden burst of speed, but with a slow, drifting elegance. It tilted slightly, revealing a series of amber lights along its lower rim that pulsed in time with that low, rhythmic thrumming he had heard on the radio. Elias felt a strange sensation in his chest, a feeling of vibration that matched the pulse of the lights. It wasn't uncomfortable. It felt almost like a deep, purring cat was resting against his ribs. The craft drifted further south, crossing over the highway with a grace that made Elias feel heavy and clumsy by comparison. He watched it until it was nothing more than a silver glint against the darkening clouds, and then, with a silent flash that illuminated the entire horizon for a fraction of a second, it was gone. Elias stood in the middle of the empty highway for a long time. The mist had turned into a steady rain, and his coat was beginning to soak through. The silence was broken by the distant sound of a truck engine, a mundane mechanical noise that felt jarring and wrong. He climbed back into his car. The dashboard lights were steady now. The radio was playing a weather report in a calm, bored voice. Everything was back to normal, except for the heavy weight of the camera in his lap and the 3 rolls of exposed film tucked into his pocket. He drove the rest of the way home in a daze. He didn't turn the radio back on. He just listened to the sound of the rain and the rhythmic sweep of the wipers. He kept seeing that silver shape in his mind, the way it had seemed to ignore the wind and the rain. When he reached his cottage, a small timber frame house tucked away at the end of a long, gravel driveway, he felt a sense of relief. He locked the front door, a habit he usually neglected in this quiet neighborhood. He went straight to his small, makeshift darkroom in the basement, but as he reached for the light switch, he stopped. His hands were shaking too much. He knew that if he tried to develop the film now, he might ruin it. He needed to be calm. He needed to be precise. He took the 3 rolls of film and placed them inside a small metal tin on his desk. He sat down in his favorite armchair, a worn corduroy thing that smelled of old books and pipe tobacco. He stared out the window at the dark woods, watching the shadows of the trees sway in the wind. He thought about calling the police. He thought about calling the local news station, but something held him back. It was a feeling of protectiveness, a sense that what he had seen was private, a secret shared between him and the silent, silver visitor. He eventually fell into a fitful sleep in the chair, his dreams filled with the sound of humming metal and the sight of amber lights pulsing in the dark. He didn't know then that the encounter on the highway was only the beginning. He didn't know that the silence of the woods outside his house was about to be broken by something far more terrestrial and far more unsettling than a craft from the stars. The next morning, the sun rose over the pines with a cold, pale light. Elias woke up with a stiff neck and a sense of renewed purpose. He would develop the film today. He would see the evidence with his own eyes. He made a pot of strong, black coffee, the scent of it filling the kitchen and grounding him in the familiar. He sat at his small kitchen table, looking out at the bird feeder. A blue jay was pecking at some sunflower seeds, its movements sharp and frantic. Elias reached out to touch the metal tin containing the film. It felt cold to the touch. He took a deep breath, savoring the warmth of the coffee mug in his hands. He told himself that he was safe. He was in his home. The world was as it had always been, but as he looked toward the gravel driveway, he noticed something. There were 2 sets of tire tracks in the mud that hadn't been there the night before. They were deep, heavy tracks made by a vehicle much heavier than his own sedan. He set his coffee down, his heart beginning to pace. He lived alone. He didn't have visitors, especially not in the middle of a rainy night. He walked to the window, squinting at the tracks. They led from the main road, circled around his small turnaround, and then headed back out. He felt a sudden, sharp prickle of unease on the back of his neck. The cozy safety of his cottage suddenly felt thin, like a veil that could be easily torn away. He turned back to the room, looking at his furniture, his books, his drawings. Everything looked the same, yet everything felt different. He walked to the basement door and opened it. The air from below was cool and smelled of chemicals. He descended the stairs, his footsteps echoing on the wood. He reached the bottom and turned on the light. His darkroom was exactly as he had left it. The trays were clean. The enlarger was covered, but then he looked at his desk. The metal tin was gone. Chapter 2: The Weight of Unseen Footsteps. The absence of the metal tin felt like a physical blow. Elias stood perfectly still in the center of his basement, the hum of the fluorescent overhead light sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden vacuum of his life. He stared at the empty spot on the scarred wooden desk where the film had sat only hours before. A small, pale ring of dust remained, a ghostly outline of the object that had held the most important images he had ever captured. He began to search, though he knew it was futile. He moved with a frantic, jerky energy that was entirely unlike him. He checked under the stacks of drawing paper. He opened the drawers of his filing cabinet, the metal rollers screeching in the quiet air. He even looked inside the chemical locker, his hands fumbling with the latch. Nothing. He sat down on his revolving stool, his knees suddenly feeling like they were made of water. He tried to think back to the night before. He had come home, he had locked the door, and he had placed the film right there. He remembered the cold touch of the tin against his palm. He remembered the way the light from the hallway had caught the edge of the lid. He stood up and walked toward the small, high window that sat at ground level in the basement wall. It was a hopper-style window, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. He examined the latch. It was closed, but as he leaned closer, he noticed a smear of dark, wet mud on the white painted frame. The mud was fresh. It hadn't dried yet in the humid basement air. Elias felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. Someone had been in his house while he slept in the armchair upstairs. They had moved through the shadows of his home with a terrifying level of silence and precision. They hadn't taken his silver tea set. They hadn't taken his expensive Nikon camera, which still sat in its bag on the kitchen table. They had come for the film. He climbed the stairs back to the main floor, his movements slow and cautious. He felt like a stranger in his own hallways. Every creak of the floorboards under his feet made him flinch. He reached the kitchen and immediately checked the front door. It was locked. He checked the back door leading to the small deck. It was also locked. They hadn't forced their way in. They had either used a key or possessed a skill for entry that made locks irrelevant. He poured the rest of his coffee into the sink, watching the dark liquid swirl down the drain. He needed to talk to someone. He needed to report the theft. But as he reached for the wall-mounted telephone in the kitchen, he paused. What would he say to the police? Would he tell them that someone had broken into his house specifically to steal rolls of film containing pictures of a flying craft? He could almost hear the dismissive tone in the officer's voice. They would think he was a crank, or perhaps just a lonely man looking for attention. He pulled his hand away from the phone. He decided he would go into town. He would go to the local hardware store and buy new locks, and then he would stop by the diner. Maybe if he sat in a public place with the smell of bacon and the sound of casual chatter, the world would start to feel solid again. He grabbed his heavy wool coat and stepped out onto the porch. The morning air was crisp and smelled of wet earth and pine needles. He walked down the steps toward his car, but as he approached the gravel turnaround, he saw them. Parked at the very end of his driveway, partially obscured by a thicket of overgrown blackberry bushes, was a car. It was a black sedan, an older model but immaculately clean. Its paint was so polished it looked like a pool of dark water. Two men were leaning against the front fender. They were dressed identically in dark, well-tailored suits that looked out of place in the rugged, rural landscape of the Washington woods. Their white shirts were crisp, and their silk ties were knotted with mathematical precision. They didn't look like hikers. They didn't look like police officers. They looked like pieces of a corporate boardroom that had been dropped into the mud. Elias froze, his hand tightening on the strap of his shoulder bag. The men didn't move toward him. They simply watched him. Their faces were neutral, devoid of any particular expression, which made their presence feel even more ominous. One of the men, the slightly taller of the two, pushed himself off the car and took a few steps forward. His shoes were black Oxfords, polished to a high shine that seemed to repel the damp gravel. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne," the man said. His voice was low and perfectly modulated, like a radio announcer from a previous era. He didn't sound angry. He sounded professional. Elias found his voice, though it felt thin and reedy in his throat. "Who are you? What are you doing on my property?" The man ignored the question. He reached into his inner suit pocket and pulled out a small, leather wallet. He flipped it open to reveal a gold badge and an identification card. Elias was too far away to read the fine print, but the eagle crest was unmistakable. "We are here regarding the events on the interstate last evening," the man continued. "We believe you may have some items that belong to a sensitive, ongoing investigation." Elias felt a surge of indignation overcome his fear. "You were in my house," he said, his voice rising. "You took my film, that's breaking and entering." The two men exchanged a brief, unreadable glance. "Mr. Thorne," the second man said, speaking for the first time. His voice was slightly higher but just as calm. "We are simply here to ensure that no classified materials are improperly handled. The film you took contains images of a prototype military exercise. Its possession by a civilian is a matter of national security." Elias shook his head. "That wasn't a plane, it didn't have wings, it didn't make a sound." The first man took another step closer. The mist seemed to swirl around him, but he didn't blink. "The weather in this region can be quite deceptive, Mr. Thorne. Reflections, atmospheric anomalies, and low-altitude testing can create many illusions." Elias felt a cold knot form in his stomach. If it was just an illusion, why did you steal the film? "We didn't steal anything," the man said, his tone turning slightly sharper though still quiet. "We secured it. And we are here to ensure that there are no other copies. No negatives, no digital transfers." He looked at Elia's camera bag. "We'll need to see the camera as well," he added, "just to verify that the internal mechanisms haven't been compromised by the atmospheric conditions." Elias stepped back, his heel catching on a stray stone. "No, this is my property. You can't just come here and demand my equipment without a warrant." The first man smiled then, but it wasn't a warm expression. It was a movement of the lips that didn't reach his eyes. His eyes remained as cold and gray as the Washington sky. "Mr. Thorne, we are trying to keep this matter simple. We don't want to involve the local authorities or the federal courts. That would be a very long and very unpleasant process for a man of your quiet reputation." He paused, letting the silence of the woods emphasize his words. "You are a talented illustrator, Elias. You have a very nice home here. It would be a shame for your life to be disrupted over a few blurry photographs of a weather balloon." The threat was veiled, but it was there, heavy and undeniable. Elias looked from the men to the dark woods surrounding his house. He felt small. He felt like the illustrations he made. Thin lines on a vast, white page, easily erased with a single stroke. He looked down at his camera bag. He knew there were no other copies. He hadn't had time to make any. The film in the tin was all there was. "I don't have anything else," Elias said, his voice barely a whisper. "You already took the film." The man in the suit nodded slowly. "We know. We just needed to hear you say it. However, we will still require the camera for a brief period. We will return it to you once it has been cleared." He held out a gloved hand. Elias felt a wave of defeat wash over him. He knew he was being bullied. He knew his rights were being trampled in the mud of his own driveway. But as he looked at the two men, he realized they weren't just individuals. They were representatives of a vast, silent machine that didn't care about the truth or the rights of a man in a tan sedan. He slowly reached into his bag and pulled out the Nikon. The metal body felt heavy and cold. He handed it to the man. "Thank you for your cooperation, Elias," the man said. He tucked the camera under his arm as if it were a common grocery item. "We suggest you take a few days off. Go for a walk. Enjoy the scenery. Forget about the lights on the highway. It's better for everyone that way." The two men turned and walked back to their black sedan. They moved with a synchronized grace that was deeply unsettling. They climbed into the car, the doors closing with a solid, muffled thud. The engine started with a low, powerful purr. They didn't look back as they drove down the gravel driveway and disappeared onto the main road. Elias stood in the silence for a long time. The blue jay had returned to the feeder, its sharp cries the only sound in the morning air. He looked down at his empty hands. He felt a profound sense of loss, but beneath it, a small, stubborn spark of anger began to glow. They had taken his film. They had taken his camera. They had threatened his home. But as he turned to go back into the house, he remembered something. He hadn't told them everything. He hadn't told them about the small, pocket-sized camera he always kept in his glove compartment as a backup. And he hadn't told them that before he had fallen asleep in his chair, he had taken one single, solitary photograph of the black sedan's license plate as it had idled at the end of his driveway in the moonlight. He walked into his kitchen and sat down at the table. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, silver casing of a single roll of film he had tucked away in his sock before leaving the house. The game wasn't over, it was just beginning. Chapter 3. The Ghost in the Machine. The interior of the cottage felt different now. To anyone else, the kitchen would have looked perfectly normal, the morning light reflecting off the copper kettle and the smell of toasted bread lingering in the air. But to Elias, the space felt violated. He found himself looking at the corners of the ceiling, wondering if small, unblinking eyes were tucked into the crown molding. He looked at the floorboards, imagining the weight of those polished black Oxfords pressing down on the wood while he had slept. He sat at his small, circular table, the single roll of film sitting before him like a live coal. This was the film from his backup camera, the small Olympus XA he kept for emergencies. It only held 12 exposures, and he had used most of them on mundane things: a sunset over the Sound, a particularly intricate spiderweb in the garden. But the last 3 frames were different. He knew he couldn't develop this film in his basement. If those men had been in his darkroom once, they would likely return. He needed to go somewhere anonymous, somewhere where a man developing a roll of film wouldn't draw any more attention than a person buying a newspaper. He decided to drive north, away from Olympia and toward the sprawling, rain-slicked streets of Seattle. It was a 90-minute drive, enough time to see if the black sedan was following him. Elias gathered a few essentials: his sketchbook, a heavy sweater, and the small Olympus camera. He walked out to his car, his eyes scanning the tree line. The woods were still. The only movement was the swaying of the ferns in the breeze. He checked his rearview mirror every 30 seconds for the first 20 miles, but the road behind him remained empty of black sedans. Only log trucks and silver minivans occupied the gray expanse of the interstate. As he drove, he thought about the men. They hadn't identified their agency. They had mentioned national security and prototypes, but there was something too polished about them, too synchronized. They felt less like government agents and more like characters from a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. He reached the outskirts of the city, the Space Needle a distant, thin needle poking through the low-hanging clouds. He found a small, independent photo lab in a neighborhood filled with used bookstores and coffee shops. The air here smelled of roasting beans and exhaust, a comfortingly industrial scent that made the events of the previous night feel like a fever dream. He handed the film to a young woman with purple-streaked hair and a bored expression. "I need these developed as soon as possible," Elias said, his voice steady. "Just the prints. No negatives saved on a disc." The woman nodded, scribbling a number on a yellow slip of paper. 2 hours, she said, her voice a flat monotone. Elias spent those 2 hours in a nearby diner, sitting in a corner booth with his back to the wall. He ordered a plate of eggs and hash browns, but he found he couldn't eat. He kept his sketchbook open, his charcoal pencil moving across the page with a life of its own. He wasn't drawing the silver craft this time. He was drawing the faces of the 2 men. He worked from memory, tracing the sharp line of the first man's jaw, the unnerving stillness of his eyes. He drew the way the silk tie sat against the white collar. As the sketches took shape, he realized something he hadn't noticed in the heat of the moment. The men looked remarkably similar. Not like brothers exactly, but like they had been cast from the same mold. Their features were symmetrical to the point of being unsettling. When the 2 hours had passed, Elias returned to the photo lab. His heart was hammering against his ribs as the woman handed him a thick white envelope. He paid in cash and walked quickly back to his car, locking the doors before he even pulled the photos out. He flipped through the first few pictures. There was the spider web, glistening with dew. There was the sunset, a wash of orange and gold. Then he reached the final frames. The first photo was blurry, taken through the glass of his living room window in the middle of the night. It showed the black sedan idling at the end of his driveway. The moonlight caught the curve of the chrome bumper. The second photo was clearer. He had used a long exposure, resting the camera on the windowsill. The license plate was visible, illuminated by the red glow of the car's taillights. Washington plate. 724 Alpha Delta Niner. Elias stared at the numbers. He felt a small sense of triumph. It was a thread, a single strand of yarn he could pull to see what unraveled. The final photo was the most unsettling. It was a shot he didn't remember taking. It was a picture of his own front door, taken from the outside, looking in. Through the glass pane of the door, he could see the silhouette of a man standing in the hallway. The man was Elias himself, asleep in his corduroy armchair in the background, but standing just a few feet away from the sleeping, Elias was one of the men in suits. He was looking directly at the camera, his face a mask of pale indifference. Elias dropped the photos onto the passenger seat as if they had burned him. The man had seen him take the picture. He had known Elias was there, even as Elias thought he was being stealthy. They weren't just monitoring him, they were playing with him. He felt a wave of cold nausea. He realized then that the camera hadn't been a backup. It had been a trap or perhaps a warning. They had let him keep that roll of film. They wanted him to see that photo. They wanted him to know that no matter how quiet he was, they were quieter. He sat in the parked car for a long time, the rain drumming a frantic rhythm on the roof. He thought about going to the police now, showing them the photo of the intruder in his house. But he looked again at the image of the man in the suit. In the photo, the man's features seemed to blur slightly, as if he were vibrating at a frequency the camera couldn't quite capture. It looked like a double exposure or a trick of the light. It wasn't the kind of evidence that would stand up in a court of law. It was the kind of evidence that would get a man sent to a psychiatric ward. Elias put the car in gear and began the long drive back to Olympia. He didn't go home, though. He drove to the State Library, a grand stone building filled with the hushed whispers of turning pages and the scent of old paper. He spent the rest of the afternoon at a computer terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He searched for the license plate number, 724 Alpha Delta Niner. The search came up empty, not just no results found, but a system error that crashed the browser every time he entered the sequence. He tried searching for the description of the car. He found hundreds of black sedans, but none that matched the specific, almost liquid sheen of the one in his driveway. He shifted his search to the craft itself. He looked for reports of unidentified aerial phenomena in the Washington area for the night of the 17th. There was nothing in the mainstream news. No reports to the highway patrol. No mentions in the local papers. It was as if the silver craft had never existed, as if the sky had been empty of everything but rain. Finally, he stumbled upon a small, archived forum for amateur astronomers and sky watchers. In a thread buried deep in the archives, he found a post from a user named Night owl. The post was dated 3 years prior in 1994. It described an encounter on a lonely stretch of highway in eastern Oregon. The details were chillingly familiar. The radio static, the rhythmic thrumming, the teardrop-shaped craft. And then the arrival of two men in dark suits who claimed to be from a sensitive department and confiscated all photographic evidence. The user ended the post with a warning. If you see them, don't argue. Give them what they want. They don't just take your pictures, they take your time. Elias felt a cold weight settle in his gut. What did that mean? They take your time. He looked at the clock on the library wall. It was 7 o'clock. He had been in the library for 3 hours, but it felt like only 30 minutes had passed. He looked at his watch. It said 4:15. His watch had stopped the moment he had entered the library, or perhaps the moment he had touched the photos in the car. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly on the linoleum floor. He felt a sudden, desperate need to be around people, to be in the light. He hurried out of the library, the cool evening air hitting him like a physical force. As he walked toward his car, he saw a payphone on the corner. On an impulse, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of change. He dialed a number he hadn't called in years. Elias, is that you? The voice on the other end was gravelly and warm. It was Sarah, his sister, who lived in a small cabin in the North Cascades. She was the only person who had ever truly understood his need for silence and his obsession with the details of the world. Sarah, Elias said, his voice cracking. I think I'm in trouble. What is it? What's happened? I saw something, Sarah, on the highway, and now there are people. They took my things. They were in my house while I was sleeping. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. The only sound was the crackle of the long-distance connection. Elias, listen to me, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a low, urgent whisper. Do you remember the stories our grandfather used to tell us? The ones about the quiet men who lived in the shadows of the mountains. Elias frowned. I thought those were just tall tales, ghost stories to keep us away from the old mines. They weren't just stories, Elias. Grandfather saw them in 47. He said they don't belong to the government. They don't belong to any country. They are the ones who keep the secrets of the earth. If they are at your door, you need to leave right now. Don't go back to the cottage. Sarah, I can't just leave. My work, my drawings. Drawings can be replaced, Elias. You can't. Go to the ranger station at Mount Rainier. Ask for a man named Miller. He's a friend. He knows how to disappear in the woods. The line suddenly went dead. Not a dial tone, but a flat, empty silence as if the wires had been cut. Elias hung up the receiver, his hand shaking. He looked across the street. Parked under a flickering street lamp was a black sedan. It wasn't the same car from his driveway. This one was newer, but it had the same liquid black paint and the same sense of predatory stillness. Elias didn't wait to see who was inside. He ran to his car, fumbled with the keys, and pulled away from the curb so fast his tires screeched. He didn't head south toward home. He headed east, toward the mountains, toward the deep, dark shadows of the Cascades where the trees grew so thick the sun never touched the ground. He didn't know if Miller existed or if his sister was right about the quiet men. He only knew that the silver hour on the highway had changed the world. The cozy, predictable life of Elias Thorne was gone, replaced by a landscape of shadows and pulsing amber lights. And behind him, always just a few miles back, the black sedan followed, its headlights two unblinking eyes in the Washington rain. Chapter 4. The Whispering Pines of Rainier. The road toward the mountains felt like a journey into another century. As the urban sprawl of the Puget Sound faded into the rearview mirror, the neon signs and concrete overpasses were replaced by the towering, indifferent majesty of the Douglas firs. The rain had transformed from a light mist into a steady, rhythmic drumming that seemed to syncopate with the hum of Elias's tires on the winding mountain highway. Elias drove with a singular focus, his eyes flitting between the road ahead and the mirror. The black sedan he had seen in the city was gone, or perhaps it was simply better at hiding. In the deep shadows of the mountain passes, every set of headlights felt like a threat, every glint of chrome in the dark felt like a prying eye. He kept his speed steady, mindful of the slick patches and the deer that often wandered onto the asphalt looking for salt. The air began to thin as he ascended. He could feel it in his lungs, a crisp, sharp coldness that tasted of snow and ancient stone. By the time he reached the turnoff for the ranger station near the Nisqually entrance of Mount Rainier National Park, the world had turned into a symphony of grays and deep greens. The ranger station was a sturdy, low-slung building made of peeled cedar logs and river rock. It looked like it had grown out of the earth itself. A single light burned in the front window, casting a warm, amber glow onto the wet porch. Elias parked his car and stepped out. The silence here was different than the silence on the highway. It wasn't empty. It was full of the sound of the wind moving through the needles and the distant, rushing roar of a glacial creek. It was a cozy spooky, kind of quiet, the kind that makes you pull your collar up and walk a little faster. He climbed the steps and knocked on the heavy wooden door. After a long moment, he heard the heavy thud of boots on floorboards. The door swung open to reveal a man who looked like he was carved from the same cedar as the walls. He was tall, with a beard the color of iron and eyes that had seen many winters. "I am looking for Miller," Elias said, his voice sounding small in the vast mountain night. The man looked at him for a long time, his gaze moving from Elias's tired face to the tan sedan idling in the lot. "Sarah Thorne's brother." Elias nodded, a wave of relief washing over him. "Yes, she told me to come here." The man stepped aside, gesturing for Elias to enter. "I am Miller. Come in. The tea is hot and the walls are thick." The interior of the station was filled with the scent of wood smoke and dried herbs. Maps of the mountain were tacked to the walls, their topographical lines looking like the whorls of a giant fingerprint. Miller led him to a small kitchen area where a cast iron stove hummed with heat. He poured a mug of dark, fragrant tea and pushed it across the table. "Sarah said you saw something you weren't supposed to see," Miller said, sitting down across from him. He didn't ask what it was. He spoke as if seeing things you weren't supposed to see was a common occurrence in these parts. "I took pictures," Elias said, "on Highway 5, a silver craft, and then the men in suits came." Miller leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "The quiet men. They don't usually come this far into the light. They prefer the shadows where the paperwork is thin and the witnesses are few." "Who are they, Miller?" "Sarah said they aren't government." Miller rubbed his beard, his fingers making a dry, rasping sound. "Government is a word for people who like to think they are in control. The men you saw, they represent something older. They are the keepers of the threshold. They make sure that the things that don't belong here stay hidden and the people who see them stay quiet." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly hum. "They don't work for a department. They work for the secret itself." Elias took a sip of the tea. It was bitter and earthy, but it warmed his chest. "They took my film. They were in my house. I have a photo of one of them. But it looks wrong, like he's not entirely there." "That's the trick of them," Miller replied. "They occupy the spaces between seconds. That is why your watch stopped. They don't just move through space, Elias. They distort the rhythm of the world around them. When they are near, time loses its grip." Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out the small silver roll of film he had kept hidden. "I have one more roll. I think they know I have it. I think they let me keep it as a test." Miller looked at the film but didn't touch it. "If they let you keep it, it's because they want to see where you take it. They aren't just following you, Elias, they are hurting you." The wind picked up outside, rattling the heavy cedar shingles of the roof. Elias felt a cold prickle on his neck. "Hurting me where?" "To where the silence is absolute," Miller said. He stood up and walked to a locked cabinet behind the desk. He pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger and laid it on the table. He flipped through the pages, which were filled with handwritten notes and small, precise drawings. "For 50 years, I've been recording the things people see on this mountain," Miller whispered. "Lights in the glaciers, humming sounds from the caves, and always the black cars. They come whenever the mountain speaks." He turned the ledger toward Elias. On the page was a sketch of a craft that looked identical to the one Elias had photographed. Below it was a date, October 12, 1947. "My grandfather," Elias whispered, his finger tracing the lines of the drawing. "He saw it too," Miller said, "and he spent the rest of his life looking for a way to prove it. He wasn't crazy, Elias. He was just a man who had seen the curtain pull back." Suddenly, the lights in the ranger station flickered. The warm amber glow dimmed to a dull orange, then brightened with a harsh, buzzing sound. The radio on the desk began to emit a low, rhythmic thrumming, the same sound Elias had heard in his car on the highway. Miller froze. "They're here." Elias stood up, his heart racing. "How? I didn't see anyone follow me." "I told you," Miller said, his voice calm but urgent. "They don't move like we do. They don't need the road." Miller walked to the window and pulled back the heavy wool curtain. Down in the parking lot, parked perfectly parallel to Elias' tan sedan, was the liquid black car. No one was inside it. The engine wasn't running, but the headlights were on, casting two long, white tunnels of light into the falling snow. "They're not here to talk this time," Miller said. He reached under the counter and pulled out a heavy, weathered flashlight. "There is a trail behind the station. It leads to an old fire lookout. It's high enough that the radio interference won't reach it. If you can get there, you might be able to broadcast a signal." "What about you?" Elias asked. "I've lived on this mountain a long time," Miller said with a grim smile. "I know the hiding spots, but you have the evidence. You have to keep moving." Elias grabbed his coat and the roll of film. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a sharp contrast to the slow, heavy dread that had been following him. Miller opened the back door and the cold mountain air rushed in, smelling of ice and ancient needles. "Stay off the main path," Miller warned. "Follow the markers with the blue paint. And Elias, don't look back. No matter what you hear, don't look back." Elias stepped out into the dark. The snow was falling in large, silent flakes that muffled the world. He moved quickly, his boots sinking into the soft earth. He could feel the mountain pressing in on him, the giant trees standing like silent sentinels in the gloom. He climbed the steep incline, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Every shadow looked like a man in a suit. Every snap of a twig sounded like a footstep. He followed the blue markers, his flashlight beam cutting a small, shaking path through the white veil of the snow. After 20 minutes of climbing, he stopped to catch his breath. He looked down toward the ranger station. It was a small, orange spark in the vast dark of the valley. As he watched, the orange spark went out. The station was plunged into total darkness. A moment later, a flash of brilliant silver light erupted from the woods near the building. It was silent, a soundless explosion that illuminated the entire ridge for a fraction of a second. In that flash, Elias saw them. They weren't just two men anymore. There were dozens of them standing in a perfect circle around the ranger station. They were motionless, their dark suits stark against the white snow. And above them, hovering just above the tree line, was the silver craft. It was larger than it had seemed on the highway. It pulsed with a deep amber light that seemed to draw the very color out of the world. Elias turned and ran. He didn't care about the blue markers anymore. He didn't care about the cold. He ran toward the high ridges, toward the fire lookout that promised a way to tell the world what he had seen. The thrumming in his ears grew louder. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a physical pressure, a vibration that made his teeth ache. He felt the air around him grow warm, the snow melting before it touched his skin. He reached the base of the fire lookout, a skeletal wooden tower perched on a jagged outcropping of rock. He scrambled up the ladder, his hands numb with cold. He reached the small glass cabin at the top and threw himself inside. The cabin was empty, save for a small radio unit and a map of the peaks. Elias fumbled with the dials, his fingers shaking so much he could barely grip the knobs. "Mayday, mayday," he whispered into the microphone. "This is Elias Thorne. I am at the North Lookout. I have evidence. I have proof." The radio emitted nothing but the low, rhythmic thrumming. Then the thrumming stopped. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing Elias had ever felt. It was a silence that seemed to have a weight, a mass that pressed down on the glass of the cabin. He looked out the window. The silver craft was no longer in the valley. It was hovering directly in front of the lookout, its brushed metal surface only a few feet from the glass. And behind the glass of the craft's central rim, Elias saw a face. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't a gray alien with large eyes. It was a face that looked exactly like his own. Chapter 5. The Mirror in the Mist. The face behind the silver surface did not move. It was an impossible reflection, a perfect anatomical duplicate of Elias Thorne, down to the slight asymmetry of his eyebrows and the faint, jagged scar on his chin from a childhood fall. But while Elias was shivering, his breath coming in white, frantic plumes in the freezing cabin, the double was perfectly still. Its eyes were not eyes so much as deep, amber pools that seemed to contain the same luminescence as the craft itself. Elias backed away from the glass, his heels hitting the small wooden desk. The radio was still clutched in his hand, though it was useless now. The silence in the cabin had become so thick it felt like he was submerged in water. Every sound he made, the scuff of his boot, the rustle of his wool coat, felt distant and muffled. He looked at his hands. They were trembling, but as he watched, the movement seemed to slow down. The world was stretching. He watched a single snowflake that had drifted through a crack in the window frame. Instead of falling, it hovered in mid-air, spinning with agonizing slowness, its crystalline geometry visible in a way that should have been impossible to the human eye. The craft did not open a door. It did not emit a beam of light. Instead, the wall of the fire lookout simply ceased to be an obstacle. The two men in suits, the ones Elias had seen in his driveway, were suddenly standing inside the small cabin. They didn't appear to have climbed the ladder. They didn't walk through the door. They were simply there, occupying the space as if they had always been a part of the room's architecture. "Mr. Thorne," the taller one said. His voice didn't come from his mouth. It resonated directly inside Elias' skull, a vibration that felt like the hum of a cello string. "You have traveled a long way to deliver what we already possess." Elias found his voice, though it felt like it belonged to someone else. "Who are you? Why do you look like me?" The man in the suit tilted his head. The movement was fluid, lacking the hitch and reset of human muscle. "We do not look like you, Elias. We are reflecting the version of the world you are capable of perceiving. If we appeared in our true architecture, your mind would simply cease to function. We choose the suit. We choose the sedan, we choose the face. It is a courtesy. The second man stepped forward. He reached out a hand, and for a moment his fingers blurred into a shimmering trail of silver light before solidifying into a gloved hand. "Give us the final roll of film." Elias clutched the silver canister in his pocket. Why does it matter? If you are so powerful, if you can step through walls and stop time, why do you care about a few grainy photographs taken by a man on a highway? The first man moved closer. His presence brought with it a scent of ozone and ancient frozen earth. Because the observation changes the outcome, Elias. You are an illustrator. You understand that a line, once drawn, cannot be undrawn. Your photographs are more than images. They are anchors. They pin this moment into your timeline. They make the impossible permanent. He gestured toward the craft hovering outside. We are the architects of the silence. We ensure that the stream of human history remains within its banks. When something from the outside, something like that craft, ripples the water, we must smooth it over. We are not your enemies. We are the maintenance crew of your reality. Elias looked at the face in the craft again. It was still watching him with those amber eyes. Is that me? Is that a version of me from somewhere else? The man in the suit smiled, and this time the expression was almost pitying. There is no somewhere else, Elias. There is only the here that you see and the everywhere that we manage. That image is a possibility that was never meant to be captured. By taking those photos, you didn't just record a craft. You recorded a tear in the fabric of your 1997. The cabin began to vibrate. The wooden beams groaned and the glass in the windows started to sing a high, piercing note. Elias felt the weight of the film in his pocket. It felt incredibly heavy now, like he was carrying a lead weight. What happened to Miller? What happened to my grandfather? The man in the suit didn't blink. Your grandfather refused to let go of his anchors. He spent his life trying to drag the silence into the light. In the end, the silence simply swallowed him. Miller is safe. He knows how to listen to the mountain. He knows when to look away. Elias looked down at the film. He thought about his quiet life, his drawings of trees and gears, his peaceful cottage in the woods. He thought about the weight of the secret he was holding. If he gave them the film, he could go back. He could have his coffee, his Nikon, and his solitude. The world would become small and understandable again. But if he kept it, he looked at the man in the suit. If I give this to you, will you leave me alone? We will do more than that, Elias, the man said. We will return the time we have taken. You will wake up in your chair. The sun will be rising. The tin on your desk will be empty, and you will remember the highway as nothing more than a trick of the light and a tired mind. The black sedan will be a shadow in a dream. Elias felt the allure of it, the cozy safety of ignorance. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver canister. He held it out in his palm. The man in the suit reached for it, his gloved fingers inches away. But Elias paused. He looked at the drawing Miller had shown him in the ledger, the drawing his grandfather had made in 1947. His grandfather hadn't given up. He had kept the anchor. He had chosen the truth over the comfort of the silence. Elias pulled his hand back. No, the atmosphere in the cabin changed instantly. The warm ozone smell turned to a biting, metallic cold. The lights didn't flicker, they vanished, leaving only the amber glow from the craft. Mr. Thorne, the man in the suit, said, and his voice was no longer a cello string. It was a grinding of tectonic plates. You are making a mistake that cannot be unmade. Elias didn't answer. He turned to the window, and with a strength he didn't know he possessed, he threw the small silver canister out into the dark. He watched it fall, a tiny glint of light descending into the vast, snow-covered forest of Mount Rainier. The men in the suits didn't move to stop him. They simply watched as the film disappeared into the white abyss. The craft outside began to spin. The amber light intensified until it was a blinding, roaring sun. Elias covered his eyes, the heat pressing against his skin. He felt a sensation of falling, of being pulled through a needle's eye, of his very molecules being stretched across the mountain range. Then there was only the sound of the wind. Elias opened his eyes. He was sitting in his corduroy armchair. The morning sun was streaming through the kitchen window, casting long, golden bars across the floor. The smell of cold coffee was in the air. He sat up, his body aching as if he had hiked 20 miles. He looked at his desk. The metal tin was there. He stood up, his heart pounding in his throat. He walked to the desk and opened the lid. The tin was empty. He looked around his house. Everything was in its place. His Nikon was sitting in its bag on the kitchen table. He checked the film counter. It was at 0. He walked to the window and looked at the driveway. There were no tire tracks. The gravel was smooth, disturbed only by the morning rain. He felt a sense of profound relief, a wave of cozy normalcy that almost made him weep. It had been a dream. A vivid, terrifying nightmare brought on by the stress of the road and the damp Washington air. He went to the kitchen and began to make a fresh pot of coffee. He listened to the birds outside. He felt the warmth of the sun on his neck. He was Elias Thorne again, the technical illustrator, the man of quiet habits. But as he reached for a coffee mug, his hand stopped. On the kitchen counter next to the toaster was a small pile of white snow. It hadn't melted yet. It sat there, a perfect cold mound of mountain powder, and resting on top of the snow was a single blue-painted stone, a marker from the trail near the ranger station. Elias looked at his wrist. His watch was still stopped at 4:15. He sat down at the table, the silence of the cottage suddenly feeling very different. It wasn't the silence of peace anymore. It was the silence of a secret. He reached for his sketchbook. He didn't draw the trees. He didn't draw the gears. He began to draw a silver craft, a teardrop shape that ignored the wind. And beneath it he drew 2 men in dark suits, their faces a mirror of his own. He knew they were still out there. He knew they were watching, but he also knew something they didn't. He knew that somewhere, deep in the woods of Mount Rainier, buried under 5 feet of fresh snow, was a silver canister. And inside that canister was the one thing the quiet men couldn't smooth over. The truth was still an anchor, and Elias Thorne was no longer afraid of the deep water. Chapter 1. The Mist Over the Falls. The city of Niagara Falls in late October feels like a place caught between 2 breaths. The frantic, colorful energy of the summer tourist season has long since evaporated, leaving behind a landscape that is both grand and oddly lonely. The air is no longer filled with the scent of cotton candy and sunblock. Instead, it carries the sharp, cold bite of the Great Lakes and the eternal, heavy dampness of the falls themselves. In October of 2008, the mist seemed particularly thick. It rose from the churning turquoise water of the Horseshoe Falls like a living thing, a white ghost that drifted up the cliffs and curled around the neon signs of the hotels. It settled on the windows of the Clifton Hill district, turning the bright lights into blurry, glowing orbs of amber and crimson. The hotel in question was the Grand Niagara View, an older establishment that sat slightly back from the main tourist drag. It was a place of faded elegance, with heavy velvet curtains in the lobby, polished brass railings that had begun to tarnish at the edges, and a carpet that muffled every footstep with the weight of 30 years of history. Working the night shift at the front desk was a young man named Julian. Julian was a student of history, a person who appreciated the quiet, liminal spaces of the world. He liked the night shift because it allowed him to exist in a bubble of stillness while the rest of the world slept. He spent his hours reading old leather-bound books and listening to the low, distant roar of the falls, a sound that was so constant it felt like the heartbeat of the earth itself. On this particular night, the clock behind the desk had just clicked over to 2:15 in the morning. The lobby was empty, illuminated only by the soft, warm glow of a few table lamps and the flickering light from the security monitors behind the desk. Julian was sipping a cup of lukewarm chamomile tea, the steam rising in thin, lazy spirals against the dim light. Everything felt perfectly normal. The radiator in the corner was clicking and hissing, a cozy, mechanical rhythm that Julian found comforting. Outside, the wind was whipping the mist against the large glass doors, creating a sound like soft, ghostly fingers tapping on the pane. Julian glanced at the security monitors. There were 16 of them in total, showing grainy black and white views of the hallways, the parking garage, and the service entrance. Most of the screens were static, showing empty corridors lined with floral wallpaper and heavy wooden doors. But on monitor 7, which showed the main entrance foyer, something caught his eye. The heavy glass doors had slid open. This was not unusual in itself, as the sensors were sensitive and often triggered by a particularly strong gust of wind. But as Julian watched, two figures stepped out of the swirling white mist and into the warm light of the foyer. They were tall, unnaturally tall. They stood at least 6 feet 4 inches, their height emphasized by the long, black trench coats they wore. The coats were made of a heavy, light-absorbing material that seemed to hold no reflection, even under the bright halogen lights of the entryway. Below the coats, Julian could see the sharp, pressed hems of black trousers and shoes so polished they looked like mirrors. They didn't move like tourists. They didn't shake the water from their coats or look around at the decor. They stood perfectly still, side by side, their shoulders squared in a way that suggested a military precision. Julian felt a small, cold ripple of unease move through him. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was more like the feeling you get when you notice a single note in a song is slightly out of tune. He set his tea down, his eyes fixed on the screen. The men turned their heads in unison toward the security camera. On the grainy monitor, their faces were pale. Not the pale of a person who spends too much time indoors, but the stark, bloodless white of fine porcelain or bleached bone. They were identical. Their features were symmetrical and sharp, with high cheekbones and thin, lipless mouths. They had no hair, not even eyebrows, and their skin appeared to be completely smooth, devoid of any pores or imperfections. Their eyes were the most unsettling part. Even on the low-resolution screen, Julian could see that they were large and dark, like two pools of ink set into a snowbank. They didn't blink. They simply stared at the camera for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, as if they were looking through the lens and directly into Julian's soul. Julian felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The cozy warmth of the lobby suddenly felt thin and fragile. He reached for the telephone, his fingers hovering over the dial. He thought about calling his manager or perhaps the local police, but what would he say? 2 tall men in coats are standing in the foyer. It wasn't a crime. As he watched, the 2 men began to move. They didn't walk so much as glide across the floor, their movements fluid and silent. They approached the inner set of doors that led to the main lobby. The doors slid open with a soft hiss. The sound of the falls outside seemed to grow louder for a moment, a deep, thrumming bass that vibrated in Julian's chest. The air in the lobby turned cold, a sudden drop in temperature that made the radiators clicking seem frantic and hollow. The men entered the lobby. Up close, without the distortion of the camera lens, they were even more imposing. They moved with a strange, rhythmic gait, their steps perfectly synchronized. They stopped 10 feet from the front desk. Julian stood up, his hands resting on the cool marble surface of the counter. He tried to summon his professional voice, the one he used for late arrivals and lost luggage. "Good evening," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Can I help you?" The men did not answer immediately. They stood in the shadows just beyond the reach of the desk lamp. The one on the left reached up and adjusted his black fedora, a movement that was slow and deliberate. His fingers were long and thin, like the legs of a spider, and his skin was so translucent that Julian could see the faint, blue tracing of veins beneath the surface. "We are looking for the occupant of room 412, the man on the right said. His voice was a shock. It was flat and toneless, a mechanical drone that sounded as if it were being generated by a machine rather than a human throat. There was no accent, no inflection, and no emotion. It was simply a series of sounds, perfectly articulated and profoundly empty. Julian swallowed hard. Room 412 was occupied by a woman named Clara Vance. She had checked in 3 days ago, a quiet, middle-aged woman who spent most of her time sitting by the window looking at the falls. She had seemed nervous, her hands constantly twisting a small, silver locket around her neck. "I am afraid I cannot give out guest information," Julian said, his heart hammering against his ribs. "It is hotel policy." The two men stepped forward into the light. Julian took an involuntary step back. Their faces were even more unnaturally smooth than they had appeared on the monitor. There were no wrinkles, no shadows, no signs of life. They looked like mannequins that had been brought to a terrifying, silent life. "Mr. Julian," the one on the left said, using his name though Julian wasn't wearing a name tag. "Policy is a human construct. We are here regarding a matter of atmospheric observation. Mistress Vance has in her possession something that does not belong in this corridor of time." Julian felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. The word corridor felt heavy and wrong. He looked down at the guest registry, but the letters seemed to be shifting and blurring before his eyes. "Is she in trouble?" Julian whispered. "She is a witness," the man on the right replied. "And a witness is a leak in the tank. We are here to seal the leak." They turned as one and headed toward the elevators. They didn't wait for Julian to respond. They didn't ask for a key. They moved with a terrifying sense of purpose, their black coats billowing slightly behind them like the wings of giant, predatory birds. Julian watched the light above the elevator doors. 1, 2, 3, 4. The elevator stopped on the 4th floor. The lobby was silent again except for the roar of the falls and the desperate, tinny clicking of the radiator. Julian looked at the security monitors. On monitor 12, he saw the doors of the 4th floor elevator slide open. The two men stepped out into the hallway. They turned left toward room 412. Julian knew he should do something. He should call room 412. He should warn her. But as he reached for the phone, he realized that the line was dead. Not a dial tone, but a flat, hollow silence that felt as deep as the gorge below the falls. He looked back at the monitor. The two men were standing in front of Clara Vance's door. They didn't knock. They didn't use a key card. The man on the left simply placed his hand on the wood of the door. For a fraction of a second, the screen flickered with a burst of static, a white, snowy interference that obscured the image. When the picture cleared, the hallway was empty. The door to room 412 was closed. Julian felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He looked at the clock. It was still 2:15 in the morning. The second hand was not moving. It was twitching back and forth, stuck in a loop of a single second. The mist outside the window seemed to press closer, a white wall that shut out the rest of the world. Julian was alone in the grand Niagara view, and the quiet men were inside the house. Chapter 2. The static in the hallway. The silence in the lobby was no longer the cozy, familiar quiet of a late shift. It had become something dense and suffocating, a vacuum that seemed to draw the very air from Julian's lungs. He stared at the analog clock on the wall, watching the slender brass second hand. It shivered against the number 3, a rhythmic, mechanical spasm that mimicked the frantic beating of his own heart. 2:15 and 15 seconds. The world had snagged on a jagged edge of time. Julian looked down at his hands, resting on the cold marble of the desk. They looked pale and distant, as if they were viewed through several feet of clear water. He felt a sudden, desperate urge to move, to break the stasis that had settled over the grand Niagara view. He stepped out from behind the safety of the mahogany counter. The carpet, usually so soft and welcoming, felt like walking through deep, dry sand. Every muscle in his body felt heavy, resisting the simple act of forward motion. He made his way toward the elevators, the brass doors gleaming in the amber light like the entrance to a tomb. He pressed the call button. It didn't glow with its usual friendly blue light. Instead, it remained dark, though the mechanical hum of the motor began to vibrate through the floorboards. The elevator arrived with a sound like a heavy sigh, the doors sliding open to reveal an interior lined with mirrors and padded velvet. Julian stepped inside. He saw himself reflected 1,000 times over, a line of Julian stretching into an infinite, shadowy distance. He pressed the button for the 4th floor. As the lift ascended, the vibration grew more intense. It wasn't the shaking of an old machine. It was a high-frequency jitter that made his teeth ache and his vision blur at the edges. The air inside the small carriage began to smell of ozone and wet stone, a scent that reminded him of the air just before a massive lightning strike. The elevator chimed, a dull, flat sound that lacked its usual cheery ring. The doors opened onto the 4th floor. The hallway was a tunnel of floral patterns and shadowed alcoves. The lights overhead were flickering in a slow, hypnotic pulse, casting long, rhythmic shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. Julian stepped out, his feet making no sound on the thick pile of the runner. He turned toward room 412. The air here was even colder than in the lobby. A fine, glittering frost had begun to form on the brass room numbers and the ornate doorknobs. It was a dry, crystalline ice that didn't belong in the humid atmosphere of the falls. He stopped several feet away from Clara Vance's door. The 2 tall men were no longer in the hallway, but the space where they had stood felt occupied, as if their presence had left a permanent dent in the air. Julian reached out a trembling hand toward the door. He intended to knock, to call out Mistress Vance's name, but before his knuckles could graze the wood, he heard a sound from within. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't the sound of a struggle. It was the sound of 1,000 whispers occurring all at once. It was a soft, rushing noise, like the sound of dry leaves being blown across a pavement, or the static between stations on an old radio. Beneath the whispers, there was a steady, rhythmic thumping, the same sound he had heard in the lobby, but louder now, more insistent. Julian pressed his ear to the door. "I don't have it," a voice said. It was Clara Vance. Her voice was thin and brittle, vibrating with a terror so profound it sounded almost like a sob. "I don't have the film. I threw the camera into the river. I didn't want to see it." The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the whispers. Mistress Vance, the mechanical voice of the tall man, replied. Its tone had not changed. It was still a flat, featureless drone. The image is not on the film. The image is in the neural architecture of your primary cortex. You have observed the intersection. You have become a part of the record. I just wanted to see the water, Clara pleaded. It was just a light, a blue light over the rapids. It didn't make a sound. It just sat there, sucking the color out of the river. The light was a signature, the man said, and your eyes are the ink. We must erase the ink to preserve the page. Julian felt a surge of protective instinct. He didn't know Clara Vance well, but he knew she was a guest in his hotel. She was under his care. He grabbed the heavy brass handle and twisted. To his surprise, the door was unlocked. It swung open with a slow, heavy grace. The room was bathed in a pulsating, violet light. It didn't come from any lamp. It seemed to be radiating from the very air itself, a shimmering haze that made the furniture look translucent. Clara Vance was sitting in the armchair by the window, her back to the falls. She looked smaller than she had at check-in, her body hunched and frail. Her eyes were wide, the pupils blown so large that her irises were mere slivers of gray. The two tall men were standing on either side of her. They hadn't taken off their hats or their trench coats. In the violet light, their pale skin looked like glowing marble. The one on the right held a small, silver instrument in his hand. It was shaped like a tuning fork, but it glowed with a soft, internal fire. "Stop," Julian said, his voice sounding surprisingly loud in the vibrating room. "Leave her alone." The two men turned their heads in unison. They didn't seem surprised by his presence. They looked at him with those deep, ink-pool eyes, and Julian felt a sudden, sharp pain in the center of his forehead, like a needle being driven into the bone. "Mr. Julian," the man on the left said, "you are interfering with a delicate calibration. Your timeline is already fragile. We suggest you return to your desk and wait for the sun." "No," Julian said, stepping into the room. The violet light felt thick and warm against his skin, like walking through a cloud of heated steam. "You're hurting her." "We are not hurting her," the man replied. "We are simplifying her. We are returning her to a state of equilibrium. When we are finished, she will remember the mist. She will remember the roar of the water, but the blue light will be gone. The intersection will be sealed." He raised the silver instrument. Clara Vance looked at Julian. For a brief second, the terror in her eyes was replaced by a look of intense, lucid clarity. "Don't let them take the dream, Julian," she whispered. "The water." It wasn't just falling. It was being called home. The man in the suit touched the silver instrument to Clara's temple. A sound erupted in the room. A high, pure note that was so beautiful and so terrible it made Julian's nose begin to bleed. The violet light flared into a blinding white sun, and for a moment Julian saw the room not as a hotel suite, but as a skeleton of vibrating lines and geometric shapes. He saw the two men not as tall figures in coats, but as pillars of swirling gray smoke that stretched up through the ceiling and down through the floor. He saw the falls outside the window. They weren't moving. The water was suspended in mid-air, a million frozen diamonds caught in a web of silver light. And then the darkness rushed back in. Julian found himself kneeling on the carpet of the hallway. The door to room 412 was closed. The flickering lights in the corridor had stabilized, glowing with a steady yellow warmth. The scent of ozone was gone, replaced by the faint, comforting smell of lavender furniture polish. He stood up, his legs shaking. He wiped the blood from his upper lip with his sleeve. He reached for the doorknob of room 412, but it was locked now. He pulled his master key from his pocket and swiped it through the reader. The light turned green. He stepped inside. The room was dark, illuminated only by the distant neon glow of the streetlights. Clara Vance was lying in the bed, the covers pulled up to her chin. She was breathing deeply and steadily, her face calm in the shadows. The armchair by the window was empty. The violet light was gone. Julian walked to the bed and whispered her name. "Clara, are you okay?" The woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at Julian with a sleepy, confused expression. "Oh, hello," she said, her voice soft and natural. "Is it time for check-out already?" "No," Julian said, his heart still racing. I heard a noise. I wanted to make sure you were all right." She smiled a gentle, weary smile. "I'm fine, dear. I was just having the loveliest dream. I was standing by the falls, and the mist was so thick I felt like I could float away on it. It was so peaceful." Julian looked at her nightstand. There was a small, silver locket sitting next to her glasses. He remembered her twisting it nervously before. Now it sat still and cold. "Do you remember anything else?" he asked. "A blue light, the men in the coats." Clara frowned, a small crease appearing between her brows. "A blue light? No, I don't think so. It was just the water, Julian, just the beautiful, falling water." She closed her eyes again, slipping back into a deep, dreamless sleep. Julian walked to the window. He looked out at the Horseshoe Falls. The mist was still rising, a white ghost in the night. The water was moving again, a relentless, powerful force of nature. He looked down at the street. Parked directly beneath the hotel's main entrance was a black sedan. It was an older model, perfectly maintained, its paint reflecting the neon lights like a pool of dark oil. Two men were standing by the car. They were looking up at the fourth floor. Julian didn't pull back from the window. He watched as they climbed into the car. The doors closed with a silent, heavy thud. The engine started without a sound, and the sedan pulled away, disappearing into the white veil of the Niagara mist. He walked back to the elevator, his mind a whirl of questions and shadows. He returned to the lobby and checked the clock. 2:16. The second hand was moving again, a steady, rhythmic tick that marked the passage of a world that had forgotten the last 60 seconds. Julian sat behind the desk and picked up his cup of chamomile tea. It was still warm. He took a sip, the herbal taste grounding him in the reality of the 1990s. He looked at the security monitors. Monitor 7 showed the foyer. It was empty. The glass doors were closed. But as he watched, he noticed a small, pale smudge on the glass of the inner door, right at the level where a very tall man would have placed his hand. He didn't go to wipe it away. He sat in the warm, golden glow of the lobby and listened to the roar of the falls. He knew that Clara Vance had forgotten, but he also knew that he never would. He took his pen and opened the night log. He didn't write about the men in the suits. He didn't write about the violet light or the frozen water. He simply wrote, 2:15 a.m. all quiet, mist heavy over the falls, guest in 412 resting comfortably. He closed the book and looked out at the night. He was Julian, the night clerk, the keeper of the silence. And for the first time in his life, the roar of the falls sounded like a warning. Chapter 3. The Resonance of Lost Echoes. The morning light began to bleed through the heavy velvet curtains of the lobby, a pale, watery gray that offered little comfort. Julian remained behind the desk, his eyes fixed on the security monitors, as if the black and white flickering could provide an anchor for his racing mind. The hotel was beginning to wake up. The distant hum of industrial vacuum cleaners and the clink of silverware from the breakfast nook signaled the return of the mundane world. Yet for Julian, the air still felt thin. He could still taste the ozone on the back of his tongue. He looked down at his night log, the ink of his last entry looking stark and deceptive. All quiet. It was the biggest lie he had ever told. At precisely 7 o'clock, his relief arrived. Marcus, a jovial man in his 50s who had worked at the Grand Niagara View for 2 decades, stomped into the lobby, shaking a wet umbrella. "Quiet night, Julian?" Marcus asked, his voice booming in the still air. Julian forced a smile, a gesture that felt like stretching old parchment. "Quiet enough, Marcus. The mist was heavy. I think it put everyone to sleep early." Marcus chuckled, hanging his yellow raincoat on the brass hook behind the desk. "That is the magic of the falls, kid. It is a giant white noise machine. People pay $300 a night just to have their brains turned off by the roar of the water." Julian nodded, gathering his things. He felt a desperate need to leave, to walk out into the cold air and see if the world still had its proper weight. But as he turned to go, his gaze drifted back to monitor 7. The smudge was still there on the glass door. In the morning light, it didn't look like a simple handprint. It looked like a crystalline frost, a delicate fractal pattern that seemed to shimmer even though the sun was obscured by clouds. "I'll see you tonight, Marcus," Julian said, his voice a bit too fast. "Take it easy, Julian. Get some sleep. You look like you've seen a ghost." Julian didn't answer. He walked toward the main entrance, his heart fluttering. As he passed the inner glass door, he paused. He reached out a finger, intending to touch the smudge, but a sudden, sharp instinct held him back. Instead, he leaned in close. The pattern on the glass was not made of oils or dirt. It was composed of tiny, microscopic ridges in the glass itself, as if the surface had been etched by a laser or frozen by a temperature far below anything found on Earth. And within the center of the frost print, there was a symbol. It was 3 overlapping circles, joined by a single, horizontal line. It was a cold, mathematical sigil that felt ancient and alien all at once. Julian hurried out of the hotel. The cold air of the Niagara Gorge hit him like a physical blow, refreshing and terrifying. He began to walk along the promenade, the railing slick with the eternal spray of the falls. To his left, the great curtain of water thundered into the abyss. He watched the white plumes of mist rising hundreds of feet into the air. He thought about what Clara Vance had said before they simplified her. The water wasn't just falling, it was being called home. He found a small, cluttered bookstore on a side street, the kind of place that smelled of vanilla and dust. The sign in the window was a hand-painted wooden board that simply said, "The Archives." Inside, he was met by a woman with silver hair and spectacles that hung from a chain around her neck. She was sitting behind a tower of National Geographic magazines, a cat curled into a ball on her lap. "Can I help you, young man?" she asked, her voice like the rustle of old paper. "I'm looking for local history," Julian said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Specifically, anything regarding unusual lights over the rapids, not the tourist illuminations. Something older." The woman peered at him over her glasses. Her eyes were sharp and knowing. "Ah, the blue harvest, the blue harvest." Julian repeated. "That is what the old-timers called it," she said, standing up and gesturing for him to follow her into the back of the shop. "Every few decades, when the moon is right and the mist is thick enough to hide the stars, people see it. A blue light that doesn't reflect off the water. It sits over the whirlpool or the rapids, and for a few minutes the falls go silent." Julian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp weather. "Silent. Truly silent," she whispered, pulling a heavy, black-bound ledger from a shelf labeled Unverified Phenomena. "No roar, no thrumming, just a silence so deep it makes your ears bleed. They say the light is drinking the sound, or perhaps it is drinking the energy of the water itself." She laid the ledger on a small wooden table. Julian flipped through the pages. There were news clippings dating back to the late 1800s, 1892. Local fishermen report silver craft over the horseshoe. claims his watch ran backward for 3 hours. 1925. 3 hikers disappear near the Devil's Hole. One returns 4 days later with no memory and skin as white as porcelain. 1956. Power grid in the city fails during a blue light event. Witness claims 2 tall men in dark suits were seen walking through the hydroelectric plant doors without keys. Julian stopped at the entry for 1956. There was a small, hand-drawn sketch of a symbol found on a piece of scrap metal near the plant. It was the 3 overlapping circles, the same symbol he had seen on the hotel door. "Who are the men in the suits?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The woman sighed, her expression turning somber. "Some call them the men in black, but that is too modern, too much like a comic book. In the old stories, they were called the Silent Echoes. They are the ones who come to clean up the mess when the world's gears slip. They ensure the secret stays a secret, even if they have to hollow out a person's mind to do it." She leaned in closer, the scent of old paper surrounding them like a shroud. "They don't want us to know what the water is for, Julian. They don't want us to know that Niagara is more than just a waterfall. It is a battery, a gateway, a point of intersection." Julian looked out the small, grimy window of the bookstore. He could see the distant mist rising from the falls. He thought of Clara Vance, sleeping peacefully in her room, her memories of the blue light replaced by a lovely dream. He thought of the 2 men, their pale, identical faces, their mechanical voices. "They took her memory," Julian said. "They had to," the woman replied. "If enough people remember the truth becomes a weight. And if the truth gets too heavy, the silence can't hold it back anymore." Julian left the bookstore with a sense of heavy purpose. He didn't go back to his apartment to sleep. Instead, he walked back to the grand Niagara view. He used his employee key to enter the service basement, a labyrinth of concrete pipes and humming boilers. He made his way to the security office, a small, cramped room filled with the glow of the master servers. The security chief was at lunch and the room was empty. Julian knew he only had a few minutes. He sat at the main terminal and accessed the digital archives from the previous night. He searched for the footage from Monitor 7 and Monitor 12. He found the timestamps, 2:15 in the morning. He clicked play. On the screen, the foyer was empty. Glass doors slid open and a gust of wind blew a few dead leaves across the carpet, but there were no tall men. There were no black trench coats. He switched to the 4th-floor camera. He saw himself. He saw Julian walking down the hallway, stopping in front of room 412. He saw himself talking to thin air. He saw himself falling to his knees and wiping blood from his lip. But through it all, Clara Vance's door remained closed. No one entered. No one left. Julian felt a wave of nausea. He knew what he had seen. He had touched the cold air. He had heard the mechanical voices. He had seen the violet light. He scrolled through the footage again, frame by frame. He was looking for something, anything that the silent echoes might have missed. And then he saw it. In the corner of the frame on Monitor 12, just as Julian was falling to his knees, there was a shadow. It wasn't the shadow of a man. It was a ripple in the video feed, a distortion that looked like heat rising from asphalt. And within that ripple, for a single, fleeting millisecond, the camera captured a reflection in the brass fire extinguisher housing on the wall. In the reflection, the 2 tall men were visible. They were standing over Julian, their pale hands glowing with that same violet light. And between them, hovering just inches off the floor, was a small, silver orb that seemed to be drinking the light from the hallway. Julian felt a cold shiver of triumph. They hadn't erased everything. The mechanical eye of the camera, unburdened by human, neural architecture, had caught a glimpse of the reality behind the veil. He reached for a floppy disk to copy the file, but as his hand touched the drive, the monitor began to hiss. The image on the screen dissolved into a frantic dance of white noise and static. The server tower beneath the desk began to emit a high-pitched whine, followed by the acrid smell of burning silicon. The room grew cold. The lights in the security office dimmed to a dull, bruised purple. Julian didn't wait. He knew the silent echoes were not done with the grand Niagara view. He scrambled out of the chair and bolted for the door. As he ran through the service tunnels, he could hear the sound of footsteps behind him. They were perfectly synchronized. A rhythmic, heavy thud-thud, thud-thud that echoed off the concrete walls. He burst out of the basement and into the crisp morning air of the parking garage. He ran to his old, battered car and threw himself inside. He didn't look back until he was 3 blocks away. In his rearview mirror, he saw the black sedan pulling out of the hotel driveway. It didn't follow him. It turned toward the falls, its dark, liquid paint disappearing into the white veil of the mist. Julian drove until he reached a quiet park overlooking the lower rapids. He sat in the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his sketchbook. He didn't draw the hotel. He didn't draw the falls. He drew the symbol, the 3 circles, the horizontal line. He knew now that he was a witness. Like Clara Vance, he had become a leak in the tank. But unlike Clara, he still had his ink. He looked at the water rushing below. It was powerful, relentless, and ancient. It had secrets that the quiet men were willing to kill to protect. And as Julian sat in the silence of the 1990s, he realized that his life as a history student was over. He was no longer just a student of the past. He was a guardian of the things that were being erased from the present. The mist over Niagara continued to rise, a white, beautiful lie that hid the blue light from the world. But Julian Thorne, a name he shared with a man in the mountains he would never meet, knew that the silence was only a thin layer of frost. And frost eventually always melts. Chapter 1: The Shadows of New York City. New York City in the early spring of 2002 was a place of frantic recovery and shifting energy. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp pavement, roasted coffee, and the metallic tang of the subway system. For Dan, a man who had spent his life exploring the boundaries between the comedic and the cosmic, the city felt like a giant, vibrating tuning fork. Dan sat in the back of a quiet cafe on the Upper West Side, the kind of place with exposed brick walls, dim amber lighting, and the constant, comforting hiss of an espresso machine. He was looking over production notes for his latest project, a documentary series titled Out There. It was a venture of passion, a journey into the unexplained, the aerial anomalies, and the visitors that he believed had been hovering at the edge of human consciousness for decades. He sipped a hot cup of herbal tea, the steam warming his face. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The footage they had gathered was remarkable. They had interviews with pilots, radar technicians, and whistleblowers whose voices trembled with the weight of what they had seen. The show was scheduled to air on a major network, and the buzz in the industry was palpable. But as he sat in the cozy warmth of the cafe, Dan felt a sudden, inexplicable prickle of unease on the back of his neck. It was the same sensation he had felt as a child when he imagined something was watching him from the dark corner of his bedroom. He looked out the large plate glass window. The street was busy with pedestrians in heavy coats, yellow taxis darting through traffic like metallic beetles, and the rhythmic sway of the trees in Central Park across the way. Then he saw it. Parked at a hydrant directly across from the cafe was a car that didn't belong in the modern bustle of 2002. It was a black sedan, an older model with heavy chrome bumpers and paint so dark it seemed to absorb the afternoon sun. It sat perfectly still, its engine idling with a low, guttural thrum that Dan could feel in the soles of his feet, even through the floor of the cafe. The windows of the sedan were tinted so deeply they appeared like sheets of obsidian. But as Dan watched, the driver's side window began to slide down. It didn't move with the mechanical whine of a modern car. It moved in total silence, a slow, predatory revelation. Behind the wheel sat a man. He was dressed in a black suit that was so crisp it looked like it had been carved from coal. His white shirt was stark and brilliant, and his black tie was knotted with a perfection that felt unnatural. The man did not look like a federal agent. He did not look like a chauffeur. He looked like an entity that had been poured into a suit. His face was pale, his skin pulled tight over high, sharp cheekbones. He wasn't wearing sunglasses. His eyes were fixed directly on Dan. It wasn't a glance. It was a stare of such profound, icy intensity that Dan felt the air in the cafe grow cold. The man's expression was one of deep, simmering menace, a look that conveyed a warning without the need for words. It was the look a gardener gives a weed before pulling it from the earth. Dan frozen, his tea forgotten. He had spent years researching the men in black, the legendary silencers of the UFO community. He had always treated the stories with a mix of curiosity and theatrical flair. But seeing this man, feeling the weight of that gaze, made the legends feel terrifyingly solid. The man in the suit didn't blink. He simply held the stare for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, ensuring that the message was received. Then, with the same silent grace, the window slid back up. The black sedan pulled away from the curb, merging into the traffic with a fluidity that made it seem to vanish almost instantly. Dan sat back in his chair, his heart racing. He looked at his production notes, the descriptions of craft over the Pacific and lights over the desert. Suddenly, the words felt dangerous. The cozy safety of his creative process had been punctured by a needle of cold reality. He paid for his tea and walked out into the street. The air felt different now. The city sound seemed muffled, as if he were walking through a dream. He headed toward his production office, a small suite of rooms filled with editing bays and stacks of videotape. When he arrived, the atmosphere was chaotic. His head producer, a woman named Sarah, was standing in the middle of the room, her face as pale as the man in the sedan. "Dan," she said, her voice shaking, "something has happened." "What is it?" "The network just called. Out There is canceled. All of it. The tapes, the contracts, the promotion. They're pulling the plug effective immediately." Dan felt a wave of cold nausea. Why, we were weeks away from the premiere. The ratings projections were massive. Sarah shook her head, her hands trembling as she held a fax. They didn't give a reason. They just said legal complications and internal restructuring. But Dan, they didn't just cancel the show. They've ordered all the master tapes to be seized. They're sending a courier in 20 minutes. Dan looked at the shelves of tapes. Hundreds of hours of testimony, evidence of things that weren't supposed to exist. He walked to the window of the office. Looking down at the street below, he saw the black sedan again. It was idling at the corner, its headlights two unblinking eyes in the twilight. "They're not just stopping the show, Sarah," Dan whispered. "They're erasing it." He realized then that the man in the suit hadn't just been giving him a menacing look. He had been delivering a sentence. Dan grabbed a single VHS tape from the desk, a rough cut of the first episode that hadn't been logged into the system yet. He tucked it under his coat. "I have to go," he said. "Where?" "Somewhere the silence can't reach," Dan replied. He walked out of the office, leaving the buzzing lights and the frantic producers behind. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, the black sedan began to follow him, moving with the slow, patient pace of a hunter who knows the prey has nowhere left to run. The night was falling over New York, and for Dan, the world was about to become very dark indeed. Chapter 2. The Hum in the Walls. The walk from the production office to the street level felt like descending into a deep, pressurized chamber. Dan could feel the weight of the single VHS tape tucked against his ribs, the plastic casing cold against his skin through the fabric of his shirt. It was a small, rectangular anchor in a world that was suddenly becoming fluid and untrustworthy. He stepped out onto the sidewalk of 8th Avenue. The city was in its evening transition, a chaotic dance of commuters rushing for the subway and the first wave of theater-goers emerging from the yellow warmth of their apartments. Usually, Dan found this energy invigorating, a testament to the messy, beautiful vitality of human life. But tonight, the crowd felt like a blurred background in a photograph, out of focus and irrelevant. He kept his head down, the brim of his cap pulled low. He walked 2 blocks north, his mind racing through a list of contacts and safe havens. He needed a place with a VCR, a place where he could duplicate the tape, and a place where the air didn't feel like it was vibrating with a hidden frequency. He glanced over his shoulder. The black sedan was there, 3 cars back, moving with a silent, heavy grace. It didn't weave through traffic. It didn't honk. It simply occupied the space behind him, a dark shadow that refused to be shaken. Dan turned sharply into a narrow side street, a shortcut that led toward a friend's recording studio. The street was lined with brick buildings and overflowing trash cans, the shadows deep and smelling of old rain and discarded cardboard. He picked up his pace, his boots echoing on the damp pavement. Halfway down the block, the streetlights began to hum. It wasn't the usual buzz of a failing ballast. It was a deep, harmonic resonance that matched the thrumming he had felt in the cafe. The orange glow of the lamps flickered, then shifted into a pale, sickly violet. Dan stopped. The air around him felt thick, as if he were walking through a pool of invisible syrup. He tried to lift his foot, but it felt like it weighed 100 pounds. From the shadows of a recessed doorway, a figure stepped out. It wasn't the man from the car. This was a second man, identical in every way. The same charcoal black suit, the same bloodless complexion, the same mechanical stillness. He stood in the center of the sidewalk, blocking Dan's path. "Mr. Aykroyd," the man said. His voice was a flat, synthesized drone that seemed to bypass Dan's ears and resonate directly in his jawbone. "Your interest in the aerial anomalies has reached its logical conclusion." Dan adjusted the tape under his coat, his fingers trembling. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just a filmmaker. I have a contract." "The contract has been rescinded," the man replied. "The architecture of your reality does not require the information you have gathered. It is a noise that interferes with the signal." He stepped forward. His movement was not a walk. It was a series of static positions, like a film skipping frames. One moment he was 10 feet away, the next he was 5. "Give us the magnetic medium," the man said. Dan backed away, his heart hammering against the VHS tape. "Why, if it's just noise, why are you so afraid of it? Why cancel a show that was going to make millions?" "Fear is a human emotion," the man said, his pale face remaining as blank as a sheet of paper. "We do not possess fear. We possess a schedule. And you are currently 3 minutes behind the required silence." The man reached out a hand. His fingers were long and tapered, the skin so smooth it looked like polished ivory. As he moved, The violet light from the street lamps intensified, and Dan felt a sharp, metallic taste fill his mouth. Suddenly, a loud, discordant blast of music erupted from a second-story window above them. It was a heavy, distorted guitar riff, someone practicing in a nearby loft. The sudden spike in acoustic energy seemed to ripple the violet light. For a fraction of a second, the man in the suit wavered, his image blurring at the edges like a bad television signal. The pressure on Dan's chest eased. Without thinking, he spun around and ran back toward the main avenue. He didn't look back. He burst out into the bright, noisy light of 8th Avenue and ducked into the first open door he saw. It was a 24-hour laundromat. The air was warm and humid, smelling of bleach and dryer sheets. It was a glorious, mundane sanctuary of suds and spinning metal. A few people were sitting on plastic chairs, staring blankly at the tumbling clothes. Dan walked to the back of the room, hiding behind a row of heavy-duty dryers. He pulled out his cell phone, his hands shaking so much he almost dropped it. He dialed a number he had memorized years ago. "John," he whispered when the line picked up. "It's Dan. I'm in a laundromat on 54th. They're here. The Quiet Men. They've shut down the show." There was a long silence on the other end. Then a low, gravelly voice replied, "Did they see the master tapes?" "They're seizing them now," Dan said, "but I have the rough cut of the Phoenix episode, the one with the multi-spectral footage. Keep it close, Dan. Don't go home. Don't go to the studio. Go to the archive, the old one in the basement of the theater. I'll meet you there in an hour." The line went dead with a sharp, electronic click. Dan tucked the phone away. He looked out the front window of the laundromat. Across the street, the black sedan was parked, its headlights off, its dark windows reflecting the neon sign of a nearby deli. They weren't coming inside. They were waiting. They knew he had to leave eventually. They were the masters of the long game, the architects of the silence that eventually swallows every loud voice. Dan looked at a discarded newspaper on a nearby table. The headline was about the stock market, a mundane world of numbers and trade. He realized that for most people, the world was exactly what it appeared to be. But for him, the veil had been pulled back, revealing a landscape of black suits and violet lights. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He looked at the spinning dryers, the clothes dancing in a repetitive, predictable circle. He wished he could climb inside one of them and be tumbled back into the life he had 24 hours ago. But as he felt the hard edge of the VHS tape against his ribs, he knew there was no going back. The Out There documentary was dead, but the truth it contained was still pulsing. He waited until a large group of people entered the laundromat, laughing and talking loudly. Using them as a shield, he slipped out the door and melted into the crowd. He headed south, moving through the shadows of the city, toward the old theater where the ghosts of the past were kept in cold storage. Behind him, the black sedan pulled away from the curb, its tires making a soft, rhythmic hiss on the wet asphalt. The chase was no longer about a television show. It was about the memory of the world, and in the heart of New York City, the silence was growing louder. Chapter 3: The Theater of Forgotten Realities. The theater was an old vaudeville house on the edge of the Hell's Kitchen district. Its marquee had been dark for decades, the light bulbs replaced by the gray dust of the city, and the intricate stone carvings of comedy and tragedy masks now weathered by a century of exhaust and rain. It was a place that time had tried to forget, a hollowed-out monument to a louder, more colorful era. Dan slipped through the narrow alleyway entrance, his key turning in the rusted lock with a heavy, metallic groan. The air inside the stage door was cool and smelled of grease paint, old velvet, and the sweet, heavy scent of decaying wood. It was a cozy, spooky atmosphere in its purest form, a sanctuary that felt like it was holding its breath. He navigated the backstage area by the dim, red glow of the emergency exit lights. The towering curtains hung like the wings of giant, sleeping moths, and the floorboards creaked under his boots with a rhythmic, predictable groan. He made his way to the basement stairs, descending into the heart of the building where the archives were kept. The basement was a labyrinth of steel shelves and cardboard boxes, containing everything from 1920s playbills to forgotten props. In the center of the room sat a small, battered metal desk with a heavy, top-loading VCR and a wood-paneled television set that looked like a relic from the late 70s. John was already there. He was a man whose age was impossible to guess, with skin like crinkled parchment and eyes that seemed to have seen too much of the out there to ever be comfortable in here. He was a former network engineer who had spent his retirement collecting the broadcasts that the official record had deleted. "You made it," John whispered, his voice barely audible over the low hum of the building's boiler. Dan pulled the VHS tape from under his coat and laid it on the desk. It felt heavier now, as if the data inside had gained physical mass. "They're right outside, John. They stopped the lights. They blurred." John nodded slowly, his fingers moving over the VCR buttons with a practiced mechanical grace. "They don't like friction, Dan. High-frequency sound, chaotic energy, heavy music. It disrupts the stabilization they need to maintain their forms. That's why they prefer the quiet. That's why they're called the quiet men." He slid the tape into the machine. The VCR swallowed it with a mechanical clunk and a whirring hiss. The television screen flickered to life, a blizzard of black and white static filling the room with a soft, crackling sound. "This is the Phoenix footage," Dan said, leaning closer to the screen. "My team caught it using a prototype thermal imaging rig. We weren't just looking at the light, we were looking at the heat signature behind the light." The static cleared. The image was grainy and bathed in shades of deep blue and neon green. It showed a wide, triangular craft hovering over a silent desert landscape. The craft didn't have engines or exhaust. Instead, it was surrounded by a shimmering, fractal halo that looked like a ripple in a pond. "Watch the center," Dan whispered. As they watched, the triangular craft began to unfold. It didn't open like a door, it peeled back like a flower, revealing a core of brilliant white energy. But it wasn't just light. Within the energy, shapes began to form, rows of tall, thin silhouettes standing in perfect, symmetrical lines. They were the men in the suits. Dozens of them standing within the heart of the craft, their forms translucent and shifting. They weren't visitors from another planet. They were being manufactured. They were being printed into reality, their suits and their ties and their pale, identical faces all part of a single, synthesized biological output. John gasped, his hand gripping the edge of the desk. "They aren't a secret agency, Dan. They're the interface." The video feed suddenly began to distort. The images of the men in the craft were replaced by a series of rapidly flashing symbols, the three overlapping circles and a horizontal line. The sound from the television shifted from the desert wind to a low, rhythmic thrumming that made the pens on the desk begin to dance. The television screen didn't just flicker, it began to bulge outward, the glass curving as if a great pressure were being applied from the inside. "He's here," John said, his voice rising in alarm. The basement door at the top of the stairs blew open with a silent, concussive force. There was no sound of a lock breaking, only the sudden change in air pressure. Standing at the top of the stairs was the man from the sedan. In the cramped, dark basement, he looked even taller, his black suit absorbing the meager red light until he looked like a hole in the world. He didn't walk down the stairs. He descended in a series of jerky, static movements, his feet never appearing to actually touch the wood. "Mr. Aykroyd," the man said. The thrumming in the room increased until it was a physical pain in Dan's ears. "You have viewed the blueprint. The observation is now a permanent contamination of your local timeline." Dan stood his ground, though his knees felt like they were made of water. "I saw how you're made. You're not men, you're just software. You're a cleanup program." The man stopped at the bottom of the stairs. His eyes, those deep ink pool voids, fixed on the television screen. "The program is the reality," he replied. "A program that is now being corrupted by your insistence on the record." He raised his hand. His fingers began to glow with a soft, violet light. Dan looked at the VCR. He knew he couldn't win a fight with an entity that could bend time. But he remembered what John had said about friction. He reached for a heavy, metal reel-to-reel tape machine sitting on a nearby shelf. It was an old, industrial unit with a massive, high-voltage motor. He flipped the power switch. The machine roared to life with a mechanical scream, the heavy reels spinning at a chaotic, unbalanced speed. The sound was loud, grinding, and filled with the friction of unoiled gears. The effect on the man in the suit was immediate. His form began to flicker violently. His face doubled, then tripled, shifting from the pale man to a gray, featureless silhouette and back again. The violet light in his hand dissipated into a shower of harmless sparks. The thrumming in the room was drowned out by the glorious, messy noise of the 1950s machinery. "Get the tape," John yelled. Dan punched the eject button on the VCR. The tape popped out and he grabbed it, the plastic warm from the machine's heat. The man in the suit tried to step forward, but his legs seemed to be caught in a loop, his movements repeating the same half-second of motion over and over again. The noise of the reel-to-reel was acting like a jammer, a shield of acoustic chaos that the quiet man's precise architecture couldn't calculate. "We have to go," Dan said, grabbing John by the arm. They scrambled toward the back of the basement, through a narrow crawl space that led to the theater's ancient coal chute. They burst out onto a side street, the cold New York air never feeling so sweet. They ran for 3 blocks before stopping in the shadow of a brightly lit diner. The city was still there, the taxis, the tourists, the steam rising from the manholes. It all looked so normal, so solid. But Dan looked down at the VHS tape in his hand. He knew that the show Out There would never air. He knew that the network would deny he had ever signed a contract. He knew that his career as a documentary filmmaker was, for all intents and purposes, over. He looked back toward the theater. The black sedan was parked at the end of the block, its headlights off, its presence a silent, patient promise. "They'll never stop, will they?" John asked, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "No," Dan said. He looked at the tape, then at the bustling, noisy city around him. "But they can only win if we're quiet." He walked to a nearby trash can and pulled out a discarded, thick envelope. He slipped the tape inside and addressed it to a private archive in central Canada, a place he knew was built inside a mountain of solid granite, far away from the violet lights and the silent sedans. "I'm going to make movies, John," Dan said, a small, stubborn smile touching his lips. "I'm going to make comedies. I'm going to make people laugh until they're loud. I'm going to fill the world with so much noise and friction that the quiet men won't be able to find a single second of silence to stand in." He dropped the envelope into a blue mail box. The metal lid closed with a loud, satisfying clang. The black sedan didn't move. The man behind the wheel simply watched as Dan Aykroyd walked away, disappearing into the neon glow of Broadway. The show was canceled. The footage was gone. But for the first time in his life, Dan felt like he was finally seeing the world clearly. It was a world that required protection, not from the monsters, but from the silence. And as he walked, he began to whistle a loud, jaunty tune, a beautiful bit of friction in the heart of the New York night. Chapter 1: The Stillness in the Lobby. The year was 2009, and the late spring air in the city was thick with the scent of blooming lilacs and the damp, cool promise of an evening rain. Shane Savar was a man who lived his life in the quiet intersections of reality. As an aerial phenomena researcher, he was accustomed to the fringes of the unknown, but he always preferred the grounded comfort of a well-lit hotel lobby to the dark, lonely stretches of the open highway. On this particular evening, the hotel where Shane was staying was a charming, older establishment. It was the kind of place that prided itself on thick, floral-patterned carpets that swallowed the sound of footsteps, and heavy brass lamps that cast a warm, buttery glow over the polished mahogany desks. The atmosphere was cozy, filled with the soft, distant murmur of the television in the breakfast nook, and the gentle, rhythmic clicking of the night clerk's computer keys. The night clerk was a woman named Eleanor. She had worked at the hotel for 20 years and had a face that suggested she had seen everything from wedding parties to weary travelers, and nothing much surprised her anymore. She liked the night shift for its predictable silence. She enjoyed the way the shadows of the tall, potted ferns danced on the walls as the street lamps outside flickered to life. Shane had been in his room on the third floor for several hours, surrounded by stacks of blurry photographs, radar printouts, and witness testimonies. He was working on a case involving a series of triangular lights seen over the local valley. The work was tedious, but Shane found a strange sort of peace in the data. He liked the puzzle of it, the way the pieces almost, but not quite, fit together. Downstairs in the lobby, the clock on the wall struck 10:15. The heavy glass doors at the entrance slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. Eleanor looked up, ready to offer a practiced, weary smile to a late check-in. But as the two men stepped through the doors, her smile faltered. They were tall, unnaturally tall. They stood nearly 7 feet, their height exaggerated by the long, black wool trench coats they wore. The coats were immaculately clean, without a single speck of dust or a drop of the light drizzle that was beginning to fall outside. Beneath the coats, they wore suits of a fabric so dark it seemed to absorb the light from the lobby lamps. They moved with a synchronized, gliding gait. They didn't walk so much as float across the floral carpet, their movements lacking the natural bounce and sway of human muscle. They approached the front desk, stopping exactly 3 feet from the marble edge. Eleanor felt a sudden, sharp chill in the air. The temperature in the lobby seemed to drop 20 degrees in an instant. The soft hum of the air conditioner turned into a low, vibrating growl that made the pens in her desk cup rattle. "Good evening," Eleanor said, her voice sounding thin and distant to her own ears. "Can I help you?" The men did not answer immediately. They stood perfectly still, their hands folded in front of them. Their skin was the color of old parchment, or perhaps the pale, translucent white of a fish's belly. It was smooth, devoid of any pores, wrinkles, or blemishes. But it was their faces that truly stopped Eleanor's heart. They had no hair, not a single strand on their heads, and more strikingly, no eyebrows and no eyelashes. Their eyes were large, almond-shaped, and a deep, bottomless black. They didn't blink. They didn't even appear to have eyelids. They simply stared at her with a steady, unblinking intensity that felt like it was pulling the thoughts right out of her head. "We are here for Shane Savar," the man on the right said. His voice was a shock. It wasn't a voice at all, but a series of tones that seemed to vibrate in Alina's chest. It was flat, mechanical, and entirely devoid of any human inflection. It sounded like a recording of a voice played through a speaker that was slightly out of tune. I believe Mr. Savar is in his room," Alina stammered. She felt a strange, heavy lethargy stealing over her limbs. Her mind felt foggy, as if she were trying to think through a thick layer of cotton. "Is he expecting you?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "We are always expected," the man on the left replied. He leaned forward slightly, and Alina found herself unable to look away from his eyes. They were hypnotic. They seemed to expand, filling her entire field of vision until the lobby, the desk, and the warm brass lamps disappeared into a void of ink. She felt a sensation of falling, a gentle, drifting descent into a place where time didn't have a name. The man on the right reached into his coat and pulled out a small, silver coin. He placed it on the marble counter. It didn't make a sound as it touched the stone. "Please tell him that the collection is complete," the man said. Alina watched the coin. It was perfectly smooth, with no markings, no face, and no value. It glowed with a soft, internal light that pulsed in time with the low vibration in the room. Then, as quickly as they had arrived, the men turned. They glided back toward the glass doors. They didn't look back. They stepped out into the night, and the doors slid shut behind them. The temperature in the lobby rushed back to normal. The hum of the air conditioner returned to its gentle, comforting purr. The fog in Alina's mind cleared, leaving her gasping for breath as if she had been underwater. She looked at the clock. It was still 10:15. The second hand was just beginning its sweep toward the 12. Not a single second had passed on the dial. She looked down at the counter. Silver coin was gone. Alina grabbed the telephone and dialed Shane Savar's room. Her hand was shaking so much she had to use both to hold the receiver. "Shane," she whispered when he answered. "Shane, you need to come down here." "What is it, Alina? You sound like you've seen a ghost." I think I just saw something much older than a ghost, Shane." Shane was down in the lobby in less than a minute. He found Alina sitting on a stool behind the desk, her face as white as the parchment skin of the visitors. She told him everything. She described the height, the coats, the lack of eyelashes, and the hypnotic, unblinking eyes. Shane listened with a grim, practiced intensity. He didn't interrupt, he didn't scoff. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. "Did they touch anything, Alina?" "Just the counter," she said, gesturing to the marble. "They put a coin down, a silver coin that glowed, but it's gone now. It vanished the moment they left." Shane walked over to the spot on the counter. He pulled a small ultraviolet light from his pocket and clicked it on. The marble surface was clean, but under the purple glow, a faint, shimmering residue was visible. It was a series of 3 overlapping circles joined by a single horizontal line. "The signature," Shane whispered. He looked toward the glass doors. The rain was coming down harder now, a gray curtain that obscured the street. He could see his own reflection in the glass, a man of 45 who suddenly looked 70. "They're closing the files, Alina," Shane said, his voice low and heavy. "Who are they, Shane?" "They are the ones who make sure the mystery stays a mystery. They are the editors of the world. And it looks like they've decided my research is a chapter that needs to be deleted." Shane looked at the security monitors. He asked Alina to play back the footage from the last 5 minutes. They sat together, watching the grainy black and white screen. The foyer was empty. The glass doors slid open for no reason, stayed open for 30 seconds, and then slid shut. The two men were not on the tape. Alina felt a fresh wave of terror wash over her. But I saw them, Shane. I talked to them. I felt the cold. I know you did, Shane said, putting a comforting hand on her shoulder. The camera only sees the light that reflects. They don't reflect light, Alina. They absorb it. He looked back at the empty foyer on the screen. He knew then that his time at the hotel was over. He knew that the stacks of photos and testimonies in his room were already being erased, their ink fading into nothing even as he stood there. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark street. For a split second, in the flash of a distant lightning bolt, he saw a black sedan parked across the road. Two tall silhouettes were standing beside it, their unblinking eyes fixed on the hotel. Shane Savar didn't run. He didn't hide. He simply sat down in one of the plush, velvet armchairs in the lobby and waited for the silence to find him. Chapter 2. The Fading Ink. The velvet chair felt unusually firm beneath Shane, as if the very atoms of the furniture were tightening in anticipation of a coming storm. He sat in the amber-lit lobby, watching the rain streak the glass doors in long, weeping lines. Beside him, Alina remained behind the desk, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles looked like small white stones. The cozy atmosphere of the hotel had been replaced by a heavy, pressurized stillness, the kind of quiet that precedes a massive power failure. Shane looked down at his leather notebook. He had spent 15 years documenting the fringes of the sky, tracking the triangles and the silver teardrops. He had always been the observer, the man behind the lens. Now the lens had been turned, and he felt the cold, clinical weight of being the subject. "I have to check the room," Shane said, his voice sounding like a rasp against sandpaper. He stood up, his legs feeling heavy and clumsy. He took the stairs this time, avoiding the elevator. He didn't want to be trapped in a metal box if the silent echoes decided to shift the gravity of the building again. Each step on the floral carpet felt like walking through a dream where the floor was made of sponge. When he reached the third floor, the hallway was deathly quiet. The vending machine at the end of the corridor, which usually hummed with a cheerful mechanical buzz, was silent. Its plastic front was dark, the glowing soda sign extinguished. Shane reached his door, room 312. He pulled his brass key from his pocket, but before he could insert it, he noticed the wood around the lock. It was charred. Not scorched by fire, but blackened and brittle, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the grain. He pushed the door open. The room was bathed in a pale, flickering violet light. It didn't come from the bedside lamps. It seemed to be emanating from his research papers. Shane scrambled to his desk. The sight that met him was one of quiet, absolute devastation. The stacks of photographs he had collected, the grainy shots of lights over the Hudson, the clear, sharp images of a craft over the Cascades, were changing. He picked one up. As he watched, the silver craft in the center of the photo began to bleed at the edges. The ink didn't run like it was wet. It simply evaporated, turning into a fine, gray mist that drifted toward the ceiling. Within seconds, the photograph was nothing more than a blank, white piece of glossy paper. He grabbed his handwritten journals. The ink on the pages was dancing. The letters were unhooking themselves from each other, swirling into chaotic patterns before vanishing into the fibers of the paper. It was a digital deletion happening in a physical world. "No," Shane whispered, his fingers clawing at the empty pages. "No, this is 15 years. This is the truth." "Mr. Savar," a voice said. Shane spun around. Standing by the window, framed by the dark, rainy night, was the taller of the two men. He hadn't made a sound. He stood perfectly still, his black trench coat looking like a silhouette cut out of the fabric of the universe. In the dim violet light of the room, Shane could see the man's face more clearly. It was a masterpiece of biological engineering, too perfect to be real. The skin was smooth as polished marble, and the absence of eyelashes made the large, black eyes look like open wounds in the face. "The collection is complete," the man said. The toneless, mechanical drone of his voice made the glass in the window vibrate. "Your contribution to the record has been processed and archived. It is no longer required in this sector." Shane clutched a blank journal to his chest. "You're erasing me. You're erasing everything I've done." "We are not erasing," the man replied. "We are reclaiming. You have spent your life gathering echoes that were never meant to be heard. We are simply returning the silence." The man stepped forward. He didn't walk, he glided, his black shoes making no sound on the floorboards. He held out his hand. In his palm sat the silver coin Alina had seen in the lobby. It wasn't a coin. Up close, Shane could see that it was a small, compressed sphere of pure information, glowing with a soft, rhythmic pulse. "This is your payment," the man said. Shane backed away until his shoulders hit the wall. "I don't want your payment, I want the truth. I want people to know what's happening in the sky." The man in the suit tilted his head. "The sky is a mirror, Shane. People only see what the architecture allows. You try to look behind the mirror. That is a violation of the lease." He held the glowing sphere closer. "If you take this, the pain of the loss will vanish. The 15 years of searching, the sleepless nights, the cold coffee in lonely diners, it will all become a pleasant, hazy dream. You will be Shane Savar, the insurance adjuster. You will be Shane Savar, the man who likes to garden on Sundays. You will be happy." Shane looked at the sphere. The light was hypnotic, a warm, pulsing amber that promised a cozy escape from the terrifying reality he had uncovered. He could feel the gravity of it, a gentle pull on his mind, inviting him to let go, to sink into the comfortable lies of the mundane. He looked at his empty desk. He looked at the blank photos. He realized that they had already won. The evidence was gone. The witnesses would forget. The silent echoes would smooth over the ripples he had made until the water was as glass. But then Shane remembered his father. He remembered a man who had stood in a field in 1967, pointing at a light that didn't belong, telling his son to never stop looking. "I refuse," Shane said, his voice gaining a sudden, sharp clarity. The man in the suit paused. The violet light in the room shifted to a harsh, flickering gray. "Refusal is not a programmed option," the man said. "I'm a human being," Shane replied, stepping away from the wall. "We aren't programs. We're messy, we're loud, and we remember things even when the ink is gone. You can take the paper, you can take the photos, but you can't take the feeling of the wind on that night in July when the sky opened up." The man in the suit stared at him. For the first time, Shane saw a flicker of something in those black, bottomless eyes. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was a moment of profound, cold calculation. The sphere in his hand began to glow brighter, the amber light turning into a blinding silver sun. The vibration in the room increased until Shane felt his very bones began to hum. "Very well," the man said. "If you will not accept the payment, you will accept the debt." The silver light exploded. Shane felt a sensation of being torn apart and stitched back together in a single microsecond. He felt the cold of the vacuum, the heat of 1,000 suns, and the crushing weight of the deep ocean. He saw the silent echoes, not as men but as pillars of static stretching across the centuries, tidying up the messes of 1,000 civilizations. Then there was only the sound of the rain. Shane woke up on the floor of his hotel room. The sun was streaming through the window, a bright, cheerful yellow that made the events of the night feel like a fevered dream. He stood up, his body aching. He looked at his desk. His research was there. The photographs were clear. The journals were filled with his own messy handwriting. Nothing had been erased. He felt a surge of triumph. He had beaten them. He had kept his memory. He had kept the truth. He walked to the desk and picked up the top photograph. It was the shot of the triangular lights over the valley. But as he looked at it, his heart stopped. The photograph was perfect. The lights were clear, but in the corner of the frame, standing in the shadows of the trees, were two tall men in black trench coats. They were looking directly at the camera. He flipped to the next photo. They were there, too, standing on a street corner in 1994, standing in the background of a witness interview in 2002. They were in every single photograph he had ever taken. They had always been there, hidden in the grain, masked by the shadows. Shane realized then what the debt was. They hadn't erased his research. They had occupied it. They had woven themselves into his life so deeply that he could no longer tell where the mystery ended and where the silent echoes began. He looked at his own hand. His skin was pale. He looked in the mirror. His eyelashes were gone. Shane Savar sat back down in his chair. He picked up his pen. He didn't write about the triangles. He didn't write about the lights. He began to write a new chapter, a chapter about the men who walk in the silence. He knew now that he wasn't a researcher anymore. He was a part of the record. He was a leak that had been sealed from the inside. Outside in the bright, cozy sunlight of 2009, a black sedan pulled away from the curb. Shane watched it go, his large, dark eyes unblinking. He was finally a part of the truth, and the truth, he realized, was the quietest thing in the world. Chapter 1. The Gray Veil of the Coast. The coast of British Columbia in the late autumn is a world defined by the color gray. It is not a dull or flat gray, but a vibrant, shifting spectrum of charcoal, slate, and silver. The mist does not merely sit upon the land. It weaves through the ancient stands of cedar and hemlock, draping over the jagged coastline like a heavy, damp blanket. In November of 2014, the weather was particularly restless. The Pacific Ocean was a churning mass of iron-colored waves, tossing white foam against the dark, barnacle-encrusted rocks. The air was thick with the scent of salt, decaying kelp, and the deep, earthy musk of the rain-soaked forest. A woman named Clara lived in a small, weathered cabin overlooking a secluded bay near Tofino. Clara was an artist, a woman who found beauty in the jagged edges of the world. She lived a quiet life, governed by the tides and the shifting light. Her cabin was a sanctuary of cozy isolation. Inside, a wood-burning stove hummed with a steady, orange heat, and the walls were lined with canvases depicting the turbulent sea. On the evening of November 14th, Clara was sitting on her porch, wrapped in a thick wool sweater that smelled of cedar smoke. She was watching the sun set, or rather, watching the sky transition from a pale pearl to a deep, bruised indigo behind the wall of clouds. At precisely 6:30 in the evening, the world went silent. The rhythmic crashing of the waves seemed to muffle, as if someone had placed a heavy pane of glass between Clara and the ocean. The wind, which had been whistling through the porch railings, died down to a breathless hush. Even the gulls, usually vocal and frantic at dusk, were nowhere to be seen. Then the lights appeared. They emerged from the water, not the sky. 3 distinct orbs of a brilliant electric blue rose from the center of the bay. They didn't splash. They didn't ripple the surface. They rose with a slow, hypnotic grace, hovering perhaps 20 feet above the white caps. The light they emitted was unlike anything Clara had ever seen. It wasn't the harsh glare of a searchlight or the soft glow of a lantern. It was a cold, saturated blue that seemed to hum. It was so intense that Clara could see the individual needles on the fir trees across the bay, illuminated in sharp, neon detail. The orbs began to move in a triangular pattern, rotating around a central point that remained perfectly dark. As they spun, a low, rhythmic thrumming began to vibrate in Clara's chest. It was a sound that felt like a deep, purring engine, a frequency that made her teeth ache and the water in her glass shimmer. She watched, transfixed, for what felt like hours, though her watch later told her it was only 4 minutes. Then, with a sudden, silent burst of speed, the orbs shot upward, vanishing into the heavy cloud layer and leaving the bay in total, crushing darkness. The sound of the waves rushed back in, a jarring, chaotic noise after the absolute silence of the blue lights. Clara sat shivering on her porch, her heart pacing like a trapped bird. She felt a profound sense of awe, but beneath it, a tiny, cold seed of unease was beginning to sprout. The next morning, the mist was thicker than usual. It pressed against the windows of the cabin, a white, sightless wall. Clara decided to drive into town to get more firewood and perhaps talk to someone about what she had seen. She needed to know if she was the only witness to the blue dance over the water. She climbed into her old, silver pickup truck and began the slow drive down the winding, gravel road that led to the main highway. The forest was dark and dripping, the giant trees leaning over the road like silent, brooding giants. As she reached the intersection with the Highway 4, she checked her rearview mirror. Tucked into the shadows of a logging turnoff was a vehicle. It was a black SUV, a modern, heavyset model that looked out of place among the battered trucks of the coast. Its paint was so clean it looked wet, reflecting the gray sky like a dark mirror. The windows were tinted a deep, impenetrable black. Clara turned onto the highway, heading east toward town. The black SUV pulled out behind her. It didn't tailgate. It didn't try to pass. It maintained a perfect 3-car-length distance. Clara slowed down. The SUV slowed down. She sped up. The SUV matched her pace with a terrifying mechanical precision. She could see the driver through the front windshield. The tinting was lighter there, revealing a silhouette that was unnervingly still. The man was dressed in a dark suit, his white collar a sharp, bright line in the dim cabin of the vehicle. He didn't look at the scenery. He didn't look at the radio. He didn't even seem to blink. His head was locked forward, his eyes fixed on the road with a singular, hypnotic focus. He looked less like a driver and more like a part of the machine itself. Clara spent 2 hours in town. She went to the grocery store, the post office, and the local cafe. Everywhere she went, the black SUV followed. When she parked, it parked at the far end of the lot. When she walked, it idled at the curb. She asked the girl at the post office if she had seen the lights the night before. Lights. The girl asked, her voice bored. Just the usual lightning from the storm, I imagine. It's November, Clara. The sky is always doing something strange. Clara didn't mention the SUV. She felt a sudden, sharp instinct to keep her observations to herself. She felt as if she were being watched by a predator that was waiting for her to make a mistake. The drive back to the cabin was the longest of her life. The sun was already dipping low, and the shadows of the forest were stretching across the road like long, black fingers. The SUV was still there, a constant, dark presence in her mirror. When she reached her driveway, she didn't stop. She drove past her cabin, continuing down the narrow track that led to a high cliff overlooking the ocean. She wanted to see if the vehicle would follow her to the very edge of the world. The SUV followed. Clara stopped her truck at the turnaround. She stepped out into the cold wind, the spray of the ocean hitting her face. She walked to the edge of the cliff and looked back. The black SUV had stopped 50 feet away. The engine was silent. The driver remained behind the wheel, his hands at 10 and 2, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at the ocean. He simply existed in a state of predatory stillness. Clara felt a wave of terror wash over her, a cold, crystalline fear that made her breath catch in her throat. She realized then that this wasn't a private investigator or a curious neighbor. This was something else. This was the silence of the blue lights made manifest in a black machine. She climbed back into her truck and drove home, her hands shaking so much she could barely grip the wheel. She locked the door of her cabin, a thing she hadn't done in 5 years. She sat by the wood-burning stove, but the heat didn't reach her bones. Outside, in the dark, rainy night of British Columbia, the black SUV sat at the end of her driveway. Its headlights were off, but Clara knew the man in the suit was still there, his unblinking eyes watching the road, waiting for the mist to rise again. It was the first day of the 3. And as the fire in the stove burned down to white ash, Clara realized that the cozy safety of her life had been erased by a single electric blue moment. Chapter 2. The cold geometry of the woods. The second day dawned with a silence that was even more profound than the first. The rain had ceased, leaving behind a world that was sodden and dripping, a landscape of saturated greens and deep, bruised purples. Clara had slept in fits and starts, her dreams filled with the rhythmic thrumming of the blue lights and the unblinking silhouette of the man in the black suit. When she pulled back the heavy wool curtains of her bedroom window, her heart gave a sharp, painful thud. The black SUV was still there. It had not moved an inch during the night. It sat at the very edge of her property line, its dark frame partially obscured by the low-hanging branches of a weeping hemlock. The condensation from the morning mist had settled on its polished surface, making it look like a large, obsidian beetle waiting in the tall grass. Clara made a pot of tea, her movements slow and deliberate. She found comfort in the routine, the whistle of the kettle, the warmth of the ceramic mug against her palms, but the cozy familiarity of her kitchen felt thin, like a veil that might tear at any moment. She sat at her small wooden table and looked out at the forest. She noticed something strange near the base of the old-growth cedar that stood at the center of her garden. It was a patch of ground where the ferns had been flattened, not in the chaotic way a deer might trample them, but in a precise, geometric shape. She put on her heavy boots and stepped outside. The air was cold and smelled of wet earth and ancient moss. As she approached the cedar, she saw that the ferns had been pressed down into 3 overlapping circles, joined by a single, perfectly straight line. It was a mark of absolute precision. There were no footprints leading to the spot. The surrounding mud was undisturbed. It was as if the symbol had been pressed into the earth by a giant, invisible stamp. Clara knelt down, reaching out to touch the flattened fronds. They felt cold, unnaturally so, as if they had been flash-frozen. As her fingers brushed the center of the symbol, a faint, high-pitched hum resonated through her arm, a vibration that made the fillings in her teeth ache. She pulled her hand back, her breath hitching in her throat. She looked toward the driveway. The driver of the SUV was still there. Through the windshield, she could see him. He hadn't changed his position. His hands were still at 10 and 2. His head was still fixed forward. Even from this distance, she could feel the weight of his presence, a cold, clinical observation that felt like a needle under her skin. She decided to test the boundaries of her cage. She walked toward the back of her property, where a narrow footbridge crossed a rushing stream. This path led deep into the forest. a place where no vehicle could follow. As she crossed the bridge, the sound of the water was loud and splashing, a natural, chaotic noise that offered a brief sense of relief. She walked for 20 minutes, following a trail that wound through giant ferns and moss-covered boulders. The forest grew darker here, the canopy of trees shutting out the meager morning light. She stopped at a small clearing and waited. She listened for the sound of snapping twigs or the rustle of a suit jacket. There was nothing but the dripping of the trees. She began to feel a small sense of triumph. Perhaps they were limited to the road. Perhaps the quiet men required the hard geometry of the highway to maintain their pursuit. She sat down on a mossy log and took a deep breath of the damp air. Then she looked up. High above her, caught in the upper branches of a towering Douglas fir, was a drone. But it wasn't a commercial drone with spinning blades and blinking lights. It was a small, silver orb, perhaps the size of a grapefruit. It had no visible means of propulsion. It hovered in the still air with a terrifying, absolute stability. The orb was silent. It didn't hum. It didn't buzz. It simply hung there, its brushed metal surface reflecting the green gloom of the forest. And on its side, etched in a faint, glowing blue, was the same symbol she had found in her garden. 3 overlapping circles. Clara stood up, her pulse racing. The orb didn't move. It didn't follow her as she began to walk back toward the cabin. It simply watched, a cold, mechanical eye in the heart of the woods. When she reached the bridge, she saw them. 2 men were standing on the far side of the stream. They were dressed identically to the driver of the SUV, black suits, black ties, white shirts. They stood perfectly still, their arms at their sides. They were tall, their height making the surrounding trees look strangely small. Clara stopped in the middle of the bridge. The water rushed beneath her, a frantic white noise. "What do you want?" she shouted, her voice echoing through the trees. The men did not answer. They didn't even acknowledge that she had spoken. They stared past her, their large, dark eyes fixed on some point in the distance. Their faces were pale and smooth, lacking any of the lines of age or character that define a human face. They looked like statues that had been dropped into the mud. One of the men reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver instrument. It looked like a tuning fork, but it glowed with a soft, internal light. He held it up, and the high-pitched hum Clara had felt in the garden returned, louder now, a piercing note that made her vision blur. "We are here to calibrate the witness," the man said. His voice didn't come from his mouth. It was a vibration that occurred inside Clara's head, a flat, mechanical drone that tasted of copper and ozone. "I'm not a witness," Clara said, her voice trembling. "I just saw some lights." "It's not a crime to look at the sky. The sky is a controlled environment," the man replied. "Your observation has introduced a variable that cannot be permitted to grow. The blue light was a signature. You have read the signature. Now the signature must be erased." The man tapped the tuning fork against his palm. A ripple of violet light moved through the forest. For a fraction of a second, the trees looked like they were made of glass. Clara saw the skeletons of the leaves, the veins of the wood, the very heartbeat of the forest. She saw the 2 men not as figures in suits, but as pillars of swirling gray static. Then the world snapped back to normal. The 2 men were gone. The bridge was empty. The sound of the stream returned, but it felt distant, as if she were listening to it through a thick wall of cotton. Clara ran back to her cabin. She didn't look at the SUV as she passed. She burst through her front door and slammed the bolt home. She leaned against the wood, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. She looked at her hands. They were covered in a fine, silver dust. She tried to wash it off in the kitchen sink, but the dust didn't respond to water. It seemed to be bonded to her skin, a shimmering, microscopic coating that glowed faintly in the shadows. She looked out the kitchen window. The black SUV was no longer at the end of the driveway. It was parked directly in front of her porch. The engine was idling, a low, powerful thrum that made the dishes in her cupboard rattle. The driver was still there. He had turned his head for the first time. He was looking directly through the kitchen window. He was looking directly at Clara. His eyes were not black. They were the same electric blue as the lights over the bay. And as he watched her, Clara felt the memories of her life, her paintings, her cabin, the smell of the cedar smoke, beginning to fade, replaced by a vast, cold, and beautiful silence. It was the second day, and the quiet men were no longer waiting. They were inside the circle. Chapter 3. The Resonance of Finality. The third day arrived not with the sun, but with a thickening of the world's weight. The morning was so heavy with fog that the trees surrounding the cabin seemed to dissolve into pillars of smoke. The moisture in the air was so dense it didn't fall as rain. It simply clung to everything, turning the cedar shingles of the porch into a dark, weeping skin. Inside the cabin, Clara sat at her small kitchen table. She had not moved since the midnight hour. The fire in the stove had long since died, leaving behind a cold, metallic scent of ash. She was staring at her hands. The silver dust that had coated her skin the day before was gone, but in its place, her fingertips felt strangely numb, as if the nerves had been replaced by a fine, humming wire. She looked out the window. The black SUV was still there, parked so close to the porch that the chrome bumper almost touched the wooden steps. The engine was silent now, but the air around the vehicle seemed to shimmer with a localized heat, distorting the view of the forest behind it. The driver was still behind the wheel. He was no longer looking at the road. He was no longer looking at Clara. He was looking at a point in space exactly 3 inches in front of his own face, his unblinking, electric blue eyes fixed on a void that only he could perceive. A soft, rhythmic tapping began on the cabin door. It wasn't the frantic pounding of someone seeking shelter. It was a slow, measured beat. 1, 2, 3. Clara stood up. She felt a strange, detached calm. The terror of the first 2 days had been burned away by the sheer intensity of the presence outside. She walked to the door and pulled back the bolt. The wood felt cold, like ice that had been sitting in the sun. She opened the door. The 2 men from the forest were standing on her porch. In the flat, gray light of the fog, their suits looked like they were made of liquid shadow. The one on the right held the silver tuning fork. The one on the left held a small, black ledger. Mistress Clara, the one with the ledger, said. The voice resonated in her mind, a low, tectonic hum. The 3 days of observation are concluded. The data has been integrated. Your timeline has been found to contain a surplus of unauthorized information. I saw the lights, Clara said. Her own voice sounded small and tinny, like a recording played from a great distance. I saw them rise from the water. The man in the suit nodded, a slow, mechanical tilt of the head. You saw the signature of the harvest. You saw the energy being reclaimed. To you, it was a light over the water. To the architecture, it was a necessary adjustment. Your memory of the event is a leak in the tank. We are here to seal it. He opened the ledger. The pages were not made of paper. They were sheets of thin, translucent crystal. As he flipped through them, Clara saw images of her own life. Her painting the bay, her walking the trails, her sitting on this very porch. But the images were changing. The blue lights were being edited out, replaced by a gray, unremarkable mist. Will it hurt? She asked. Pain is a biological friction, the man replied. We do not use friction, we use resonance. You will not feel a loss. You will simply feel lighter. The man with the tuning fork stepped forward. He raised the instrument and struck it against his palm. The sound was not a note. It was a vibration that bypassed the air and struck directly at the base of Clara's skull. The world around her began to blur. The trees, the cabin, the heavy fog, it all started to unspool like a thread being pulled from a garment. She looked at the SUV. The driver had stepped out of the vehicle. He was standing on the gravel, his blue eyes glowing with a terrifying intensity. He reached out a hand, and the air between them began to fold. Clara felt her memories beginning to slide away. She tried to grab onto them, the smell of the salt, the sound of the waves, the thrill of seeing those orbs rise from the bay. But they were like water in her hands, slipping through her fingers and vanishing into the gray mist. "Don't take the color," she whispered. "The color is a distraction," the man in the suit replied. "The silence is the truth." The vibration from the tuning fork increased. The cabin vanished. The forest vanished. Clara felt herself floating in a vast, white void. She saw the three men standing in a triangle around her, their suits merging into the white background until only their pale faces and unblinking eyes remained. The man with the ledger touched a crystal page to her forehead. A flash of brilliant, electric blue light filled the void. It was the light from the bay, beautiful and terrible and absolute. For a single second, Clara saw everything. She saw the quiet men, not as intruders, but as the immune system of the world. She saw the blue lights not as UFOs, but as the earth breathing. And then the light went out. Clara woke up on her porch. The sun was shining, a warm, golden light that made the cedar shingles look bright and inviting. The air smelled of pine and salt. A few gulls were crying in the distance, their voices sharp and cheerful. She sat up, rubbing her head. She felt a bit groggy, as if she had taken a long, deep nap in the middle of the afternoon. What was I doing out here? She wondered. She looked toward her driveway. It was empty. The gravel was smooth and undisturbed. She looked at the center of her garden. The ferns were swaying gently in the breeze, green and healthy. She walked into her kitchen and began to make a pot of tea. She felt a wonderful sense of peace, a cozy contentment that she couldn't quite explain. Her life felt simple and clean, like a canvas that had been wiped and primed for a new painting. She sat at her table and looked out at the bay. The water was a sparkling sapphire blue. I should paint that, she thought, just the water, just the beautiful, quiet water. She reached for her sketchbook, but as she opened it, she paused. On the first page, in her own handwriting, were 3 words. "Don't forget the blue." Clara frowned. She didn't remember writing that. She looked at the words for a long time, a tiny, flickering shadow of a memory dancing at the edge of her mind. A blue light, a black car, a man who never looked away. But the feeling was gone as quickly as it had come. She took an eraser and gently removed the words, the graphite disappearing into the white paper. She began to draw the waves, her hand moving with a steady, practiced grace. She was Clara, the artist. She was the woman who lived by the tides. And in the bright, beautiful afternoon of British Columbia, the silence was finally absolute.